One of these 12 people is going to find the One Piece. That is according to Eiichiro Oda, because in chapter 1121, there are 12 major candidates identified in this race. So we're going to go through each of them, explain why it is they want the One Piece, as well as why they're uniquely positioned to claim it, and finally, who I believe is the most likely candidate to end up with the One Piece. And I'll give you a slight spoiler for that right now, I don't think it's gonna be Luffy. So let's cover that potentially outrageous statement first, because for this whole series, Luffy has been repeatedly yelling that he is the one who will find the One Piece and become the Pirate King. He even gets personally offended when someone else claims that they're going to do the same. However, Luffy's dream isn't to find the One Piece. Luffy's dream isn't even to become the Pirate King. Those are just steps 1 and 2 towards what he sees as his greater dream, which he revealed to his crew in chapter 1060, resulting in an assortment of reactions from laughter, shock, stunned silence, admiration, and even exasperation. So we as reading and watching people still don't know exactly what this dream is. We have theories and ideas, but nothing is confirmed. All we know is that Luffy revealed the reason why he's gunning to become the Pirate King is to make this dream come true. To most people in this race, finding the One Piece is the full stop to their story. However, for Luffy, it's just a means to an even greater end, meaning that a possibility exists that Luffy will find another way to achieve his dream without claiming the One Piece, or more likely, if he does find the One Piece, he may not necessarily keep it, instead handing it off to someone else because, as per the words of Dr. Vegapunk, the fate of the world now rests in the hands of the one who finds it, the person who lays claim to the One Piece. Which, I don't know, that sounds an awful lot like Hera sort of talk to me. And Luffy despises the concept of being a hero. He always has since the days of being raised by his grandfather, Garp the hero. Being a hero comes with obligation, and obligation is antithetical to Luffy's desire for maximum freedom. Luffy will no doubt play a massive, perhaps even the most important role in bringing about the dawn of the world, but he's not the one who's going to take responsibility for guiding it. So to be clear, I think it's very possible that Luffy is a strong candidate to be the first person to find the One Piece, but at this moment, I don't believe that he'll be the one to use it in the way that Vegapunk is describing. And really, this would be the most Luffy possible thing to do. To casually give up the One Piece because he no longer sees it as necessary to whatever his dream is. And I did take a poll asking all of the Grand Fleet members to select who they think is most likely to end up with the One Piece. And whilst Luffy did rank in first place with 44% of the vote, that does mean that a crazy 56% of you think that Luffy is not going to end up with it. So the majority of you very intelligent and aesthetically pleasing people who watch this channel say that the main character is not the most likely person, and that's very exciting because that leaves the door wide open for 11 other individuals to battle it out, with the next identified candidate being Red-Haired Shanks, the only remaining OG Emperor of the Sea, and a man who has already had the opportunity to travel to Laugh Tale with the former Pirate King Goldie Roger, but declined in order to take care of a sick clown friend. At the moment, I believe that Shanks is the closest person to claiming the One Piece, because he's the one who already has the most prep work done. He did take 2 road poneglyph rubbings from Eustace Kid for being needed to locate Laugh Tale itself, but Shanks was already present when Roger found all 4 road poneglyphs during his adventure, and it's entirely possible that Shanks already knows where Laugh Tale is and has been gatekeeping the island in preparation for this pivotal moment in fictional history. He's also currently the most powerful of the 4 emperors, and perhaps even the strongest of all 12 of these candidates. Because from what we've seen so far, his haki alone puts everyone else to shame, and Shanks has declared his intentions to claim that their One Piece, potentially so that he can fulfill Roger's legacy and do what he was unable to do. So frankly, good luck to anyone who tries to stop him. However, I think we all know that this isn't how this fictional pirate story is going to go. The fact that Shanks is so obviously the frontrunner in this race is exactly why I think he won't win. It would be too easy and too happy of an ending, and I suspect that Shanks is likely going to fall victim to an unfortunate Blackbeard-related incident. Who, speaking of, is our next candidate to claim the One Piece, and I honestly believe that Blackbeard's chances in this race are pretty disgustingly strong. Firstly, as to why Blackbeard wants the Thing to become the Pirate King in the first place, it's heavily hinted that he was the one who inherited the will of Roger's greatest foe, Roxty Xebec, whose ambition was to violently overthrow the world government and install himself as the king of the world. And this is hinted through Blackbeard's flagship, which is named the Saber of Xebec, giving a very acting on behalf of Xebec kind of vibe. And now, if I had to bet some cold hard cash money, I would strongly consider putting a fat stack on the even fatter Blackbeard, because One Piece is a story. story. And the final saga is going to need to have a hard-hitting dramatic low point, and a real good option for that would be to have Blackbeard be the first one to find the One Piece and become the next Pirate King, which puts Luffy at his lowest point, with all of his ambition having been stolen from him. And now Luffy needs to Simba himself all the way up to Pride Rock and defeat a very obese Scar. So to be clear here, I don't think there's any world where Blackbeard keeps the One Piece. He's a bad man, and look, bad men get defeated in shonen manga, but not before doing some very bad things. And one of the baddest of things he could possibly do is directly challenge or even obtain Luffy's series goal. And one way the Blackbeard could ultimately be thwarted is by a surprise candidate amongst the Chosen 12. The second biggest twist that Oda threw at me with this final roster was the inclusion of a former Marine Admiral and now professional scallywag Kuzan, primarily because at no stage has he ever expressed a desire for really anything, except for taking a lovely nap every now and then. When we first met him as an admiral, his motto was lazy justice, something he seems to have abandoned because these days he is very active as a pirate. But I suspect that Kuzan might have his eyes on the One Piece because the justice of the world government failed him one too many times. One key event being the genocide of O'Hara and the rise of a man who enacted said genocide as the new fleet admiral of the Marines. Kuzan no longer saw the Marines as a viable avenue for justice, nor does he necessarily seek any organization as that correct path forward. I mean, yes, at the moment Kuzan serves Blackbeard, but I think that's because he and I share similar thoughts in that Blackbeard is the most likely one who's going to reach Laugh Tale first, and after that point Kuzan could enact his very expected betrayal and try to take the One Piece to change the world to his vision of justice, whatever that may be. Maybe everyone gets a free fridge or something, because we really know next to nothing about Kuzan's history or even his personality. He's a pretty incredible wild card going into this race, and having formed an alliance with Blackbeard, he's an extremely strong contender, and who knows, maybe after we see his history, he may turn out to be the most appropriate person to end up with the One Piece. But at the moment, all I can say is that you guys do not think so, because mate, that is not a lot of votes. Either way, Kuzan's in for a pretty rough fight battle, because the man who made Kuzan turn his back on justice and become Just Ice is also one of the Chosen 12, our current fleet admiral Sakazuki, who we mentioned before. He's the bad genocide man who fought with Kuzan for 10 days straight to claim the fleet admiral position. And you know we've got time, they could go for another 10. Sakazuki is a really interesting contender though, because after becoming Fleet Admiral, he has been growing increasingly dissatisfied with the world government that he serves. And if he takes Vegapunk's words to heart, I could see Sakazuki instituting a full-scale coup and commandeering the bulk of the Marines under his direct command to launch an offensive mission to Laugh Tale. Because we know that Sakazuki's vision of justice doesn't match the world government's. He has a mission to eradicate evil from the planet, and they're not letting him complete that mission. If anything, with systems like the 7 warlords and the lawless existence of the world nobles, the world government are actually propagating evil, and perhaps Sakazuki will start to think that, you know what, if I, Sakazuki, had the power of the One Piece, then maybe I would be able to deal with all of the evil on all sides. Pirates, revolutionaries, world government, all in one punch in the dick with a magma fist. Oda did once say that if Sakazuki was the protagonist of One Piece, then the series would be over within a year. Not a year of in-world time, a year of publishing time, which is like half a day in world if we go by the Dressrosa rate. So Sakazuki is a proper force to be reckoned with, and in command of by far the largest military about to clash in this final war. And while he is a bad dude, and look, we've already talked about what happens to bad dudes, which is not winning in fictional pirate stories, and so he's very unlikely to end up with One Piece, you'd best believe that he is still going to cause an almost literal hell of a mess in this race. However, even if Sakazuki absconds with the Marines, the world government is still well and truly in this. As Saint Emu Nerona, inhabitor of Silhouette, sitter of thrones, and secret ruler of the majority of the surface world, now has his only identifiable traits being eyes firmly locked on Joy Boy's treasure. Because that's what the One Piece is. It's the thing that the dude left there. So this race is more personal to Emu than any of the other Chosen 12, because all of this is only happening arguably due to his failure 800 years ago. The battle against Joy Boy was won, but the war is still ongoing to this very day. And this whole Pirate King One Piece fiasco is all Joy Boy's doing, and Emu has been struggling to clean up this mess for the better part of a millennia. So for Emu, it's time to win this once and for all. But he's very unlikely to be doing that alone, because serving Emu is another of the 12 chosen ones, Saint Figurland Garling, Supreme Commander of the Holy Knights and assumed relative of Figurland Shanks, who we talked about earlier. The important thing to note here is that Garling is not just a single contender. he brings with him the full force of the Holy Knights, a group that 38 years ago fought and survived in a 4-way battle royale on God Valley against the Rocks Pirates, the Roger Pirates, and the Marines. So Figgleland Garling is a man to be held in the same company as figures such as Rox D. Zebek, Edward Newgate, Goldie Roger, and Monkey D. Garp, which makes him an utterly terrifying lurking legend who, even in his older years, is still going to be a world-class combatant. I do find it interesting that Oda decided to single Garling out, when theoretically he does work for Emu, although it is difficult to know how aware of Emu the Holy Knights are, because his existence seems to be kept secret from anyone who isn't one of the 5 elders. So if Garling is a particularly ambitious person, then he could see the One Piece as an opportunity to seize power for himself. And even if not, he is going to prove a monumental challenge to anyone unfortunate enough to cross paths with him. And the most likely candidate to do that thing I just said at this stage seems to be Monkey D. Dragon, father of Luffy, leader of the Revolutionary Army, and Easterly Direction appreciator. So traditionally, the Revolutionary Army haven't been too concerned with the One Piece, nor has any faction except for the pirates, I should say. But thanks to Vegapunk's message, claiming the One Piece and the goal of the Revolutionary Army are now perfectly in concert. Because for Dragon to truly change this world, you'd best believe that he's going to make an effort to get the thing it is that gives him that power. However, Dragon's biggest concern in the fight to come are the Holy Knights. He seems to view them as far more of a threat than any Emperor of the Sea, or even the entirety of the Marines, further fluffing the throbbing candidacy of Figgleland Garling. So it does look as if Dragon might be being set up to fight Garling. The power of wind versus an old man so incontinent that he also has the power of uncontrollable wind. I really don't see either of them being the ones to win this race though, and neither do most of you, because Dragon and Figgleland Garling combined barely managed to breach 1% of the Grand Fleet vote. And you know why? Because you all know that the One Piece is incredibly ageist. Even in Vegapunk's speech, he alludes to the idea that new eras can only come through the fall of old legends. And at this stage, Garling is a forgotten prune in the fridge, waiting to be thrown out the next time the fridge is making a bit of a weird smell and you can't quite figure out what it is. So you just throw everything out because it was probably everything. And Dragon isn't much better. This whole new era business is a very young man's game, and he's 55. So I think that the Revolutionary Army need a younger, hotter, and blonder man to lay claim to the One Piece, who is also given to us in the form of Sabo, another of the Chosen 12, the Chief of Staff of the Revolutionary Army, and the newly crowned Flame Emperor. Sabo is a character who has very much not been on my radar, at least not for being the dude to find or end up with the One Piece. However, consider this. Through his brothership, Sabo inherited the will of Port Gastiers, whose father was Goldie Roger, the former Pirate King. So in a way, Sabo is one of the most appropriate people possible to fulfill Roger's legacy. But the other key aspect to note is that Sabo is also Luffy's brother. So if Luffy was to give up the One Piece, then I think that Sabo would be a pretty solid candidate to hand it off to. Luffy already gave Sabo Ace's Devil Fruit, so why not the One Piece as well? And this is primarily because Luffy trusts Sabo implicitly. If there's an important thing to be done and I'm Luffy, then I'm thinking that Sabo is probably the right guy to trust with the important thing to do. And he could be a great candidate to lead the world into a new age. A much younger Dragon without the stigma that comes with Dragon being the most wanted man in the world and viewed as evil and everything. I think that Sabo is actually a very solid option if Oda wanted to go down that path, but he's definitely not my first or even second most likely pick. And before addressing them, I should point out that there is a mystery candidate amongst the 12 chosen, a silhouetted figure that we have assumedly not met at the time of this recording. And I've already speculated pretty heavily on who this could be in other videos, so I'm not just going to regurgitate all of that here, because I am not a mother bird and you are not my bird children. But it's almost impossible to make a judgment on this figure's chances at the moment, whoever they may be. So we're just going to put a bookmark here and come back to it later, maybe. But here are my top 2 predictions. Firstly, I think that Emperor of the Sea, Buggy the Clown, is an incredibly strong contender. No, I am not joking, because him ending up with the One Piece and becoming Pirate King is something I can see happening purely because it would be the most hilarious outcome. This is One Piece, and in One Piece, Oda often does the weirdest thing possible, and this would be that thing. The island we're all fighting over is called Laugh Tale, and I don't think there's any more appropriate person to take that crown than a clown. But it's also not completely out of nowhere because Buggy was a member of Roger's crew as well, and in a way would be fulfilling his captain's legacy, meaning that Shanks doesn't have to. He can go off and do whatever it is mentors do, die probably, but I could also see a scenario where someone else does actually get the One Piece, but in a manner best described as somehow, Buggy ends up being the one credited for it. That's just how this magnificent character is, constantly failing upwards, and there really isn't much further up to fail, so Pirate King, here we come. And that is exactly why the Grand Fleet ranked Buggy in second place with over 1,500 votes, because approximately 35% of you have seen the setup for the greatest joke in manga history and have faith in Oda to nail that punchline, which I would be thrilled with. However, lately I've seen a different potential outcome, which is why my personal pick for the character I see ending up with One Piece is Koby. By far the most out of place character in this roster, but without a doubt the most kind-hearted and truly justice-driven person that you could ever hope to end up with this kind of power. Koby is the very first person that Luffy liberated on his extremely long journey. So it would be a fantastic bookend if Koby was the person who Luffy trusted in the end, that one person he met in the beginning. Because as much as Luffy trusts Sabo, I think that he has that same level of trust in Koby. Luffy's very binary that way. It's not about how much he trusts you. You either have all of it or you have none of it. And Koby does also have the inherited will of Luffy's grandfather Garp, and is someone who is willing to take on the obligation of being a hero. Someone who could potentially unite the Marines, the Revolutionary Army, and the pirates. I know that I'd trust Koby to make the right decision about the future of the world, much more so than any of the other 11, I think. And Koby also happens to be the youngest of the 12 chosen, and so the one with the most stake in the future. And Koby's candidacy is picking up some steam with the Grand Fleet, as he was ranked in a distant third place for most likely candidate, but I've definitely got my eyes on him, and if you didn't get to vote, then feel free to place your bet in the comments, and let's kick this race off. What is the Will of D? Occasionally in the One Piece world, you'll come across characters with this ever so mysterious initial D, such as series protagonist Monkey D. Luffy. And as at least 93.4% of my audience will understand, at first you don't think anything of the D, but there comes a special time in life when that D grows on you and it starts to consume your every thought. That is One Piece fans, because the D is the key to everything. It doesn't stand for something mundane like Dennis or Dwayne, nor does it stand for something as grand as recent theories such as Descendant Dream or Dawn. The Will of D, for as much as it has radically shaped events over the past millennia, holds a bizarrely simple meaning, likely conjured by an ancient group of people to prove their friendship to one another. In a very similar maneuver to a modern group of friends who did the exact same thing, but picked a letter much further down the alphabet. This is the meaning of the Will of D. And before we continue, I need to shout out Dak Sake, who inspired the foundation of this video with his personal examination of the D. He loves the D. And there will be a link to his video in the description. But here are 3 things you need to know immediately to solve this mystery. 1. The D is not exclusive to a species, race, or any single civilization. While we've seen mostly humans bear the initial D, there's also a clan of giants with the D, indicating that this letter can be borne by anyone. Secondly, there is no exclusive ideology within D carriers. Those with the middle initial D generally make up the greatest heroes of the world, but they can also be the greatest villains, like Marshall D. Teach and Rox D. Zebek. The only thing that these D swingers have in common when it comes to this is that they either end up becoming great heroes of the world or great villains. And thirdly, former world noble Don Quixote Rocinante referred to those who possess the middle initial D as the enemies of the gods. Although I want to note that in literal Japanese, Rocinante says it much stronger than that. He refers to them as Kami no Tentaki, meaning the natural enemy of God, which is a position that Oda has been consistently putting Luffy in over the course of One Piece, such as his rubber powers being the natural counter to God Enel's lightning, or being the only person willing to punch St. Charlos and defeating Doflamingo, the latter two of whom are world nobles who claim to be gods. So no one in this world is more of an enemy to anyone who uses the title of God than Luffy, which is appropriate because Luffy himself possesses the devil fruit abilities of an alleged god, the Sun God. And question, when was the first time that Luffy was referenced as the Sun God? That's right, Alabasta, but you probably don't remember, which is why you also don't remember what the Will of D is, which was revealed in that very arc as well. Let me be perfectly clear. Alabasta is a very important arc. This cannot be understated, so what we're going to do is we're going to put that sentence in bold on the screen for proper emphasis. So one thing you'll often hear about One Piece is that Oda only planned it to run for 5 years. And this was true at the beginning. Oda abandoned that plan either during or after the East Blue Saga because he was having too much fun drawing. However, he still intended to conclude the series in a reasonable amount of time, which means that all of early One Piece should be examined with an unhealthy level of scrutiny, because these early arcs were intended to contain everything Oda needed to set up the ending of the story whenever that came about. Which is why now in very late stage One Piece, we're seeing all of these classic elements come to prominence again, like the Elbaf giants appearing on Egghead and the renewed relevance of Nefeltari Vivi, who at this very moment may be the most important character in the entire series, at least from the perspective of Emu. We might not be capable of registering everything at the time because we don't have the plan, but I think that everything you need to solve almost every major mystery in One Piece was given to us in those earlier arcs, specifically by the end of Skypiea, including the Will of D. So let me give you a mind-blowing example of the sort of thing I mean. I was informed of this little detail from a video by Sawyer7Mage, so shout out to him, but when Robin and Cobra enter the tomb of Alabasta, the first thing we're greeted with is this grand depiction of a sun being guarded on either side by a jackal and a falcon. The sun in this case represents Alabasta. Their national flag is a sun symbol. It is the country of the sun. And the jackal and falcon are the traditional guardian deities of the nation, in the modern day represented by Pell and Chaka. But this isn't just a throwaway piece of flavor. Oda chose this room to stage Luffy and Crocodile's fight for a very specific reason, and he very often features this monument in some very prominent panels. For example, in the iconic moment when Luffy claims that he'll be the Pirate King, Luffy is placed directly in the middle of this monument, occupying the space of the sun, which is one of the earliest references to Luffy having the powers of the sun god Nika. It's also very nice because the sun was the symbol of Alabasta, so this is Luffy standing up to represent the country's struggle against Crocodile. But there's a lot that goes into the planning of these panels that 99.9% of people, in this case including myself originally, never notice. And then in the next big arc, Skypiea, the sun god name is dropped for the first time as an integral aspect of a society directly connected to the ancient kingdom, as well as Oda depicting Luffy in the now classic Nika silhouette for the first time. Also, as a side note, it's a personal theory of mine that Pluton was originally supposed to be hidden under Alabasta, and that's why the Nefeltari family refused to move to Marijois, because they needed to stay to ensure its protection. But as time went on, the idea of Wano was developed, and that element got taken and Pluton got plonked onto the island to give Wano some extra oomph instead. But all of the major elements, all of the big picture mysteries is stuff that Oda had planned out well in advance. And not being able to predict that One Piece would go on for almost 3 decades, he sneakily dumped a lot of the answers to our questions in early arcs. Which brings us to the Will of D. During Alabasta, after encountering Bon Clay, an enemy that could morph into, and in Nami's case, expose their bodies, Vivi and the Straw Hats drew the letter X on their arms to prove that they were trustworthy and actually them. And what was initially a very practical symbol then evolved into something much bigger than any of the crew could have anticipated at the time. The main use of the X was to signal to Vivi without the world government knowing that they were affiliated. Because if they'd shouted and done something traditional like verbally say goodbye, then Vivi was going to get into a lot of trouble for cavorting with those nasty pirates. So instead, they used the X to deliver a secret message. One stating that even though Vivi chose to remain on Alabasta, that X is the eternal proof that Vivi is a friend of the Straw Hats and in fact a crew member. And so our proposal from here is that the Will of D was a very similar idea. 800 years ago, a certain pirate crew came up with a simple and heartwarming way to communicate a message that went on to shape generations as this middle initial was passed down through the ages. At the time of this recording, the oldest known D wielder that we know of is Nefeltari Lily, who just so happens to be the ancestor of Nefeltari Vivi, who was the reason why the Straw Hats created the X symbol in the first place. And along the same lines, Lily was potentially the reason why the D symbol was created. She and the Alabasta nation were one of the 20 founding kingdoms of the world government, and they were all publicly at war with the ancient kingdom. However, it could be the case that to signal to Joy Boy that she was on his side, Lily signed any correspondence with the name Nefeltari D Lily, something so innocuous that no one would bother to question it if they saw it, but something that, if understood, firmly proved where Lily's allegiances lay. And it worked because to this day, Emu wasn't sure about exactly what happened with Lily, although Emu himself does assert that he knows what the D means. The D is the name of those who once opposed us. Those who bubble up from every corner of the world bearing the D are nothing but empty husks, ignorant of the meaning of their name. However, this recent development has its roots in Queen Lily's great mistake of 800 years ago, as does the curiosity curiosity of the scholars rummaging after the Void Century, as does the spate of pirates seeking the poneglyphs for treasure. If not for Lily's mistake on that fateful day, the loathsome relics called the poneglyphs would not have been scattered across the world. And this unfortunate event of the past has one disastrous potential explanation. Was the liberation of the poneglyphs actually a simple mistake, or was it planned? Emu then asked Nefeltari Cobra for the full name written on the ancient letter he found, to which Cobra replied, Nefeltari D. Lily. And Emu doesn't like that. He does not like that at all, implying that Emu was unaware that Lily possessed the will of D. And the way I read it is that D is proof that Lily betrayed what would become known as the world government, and this poneglyph business was not a mistake. They were scattered on purpose. Whereas if the letter was just signed as Nefeltari Lily, no D, then this event of the past would have been an accident. But what this shows is that the D played its role to perfection. Emu may have learned its meaning, but the shroud it gave Lily took Emu 800 years to uncover. And that's very important because if Emu had known that Lily was D, then it's very unlikely that he would have allowed Alabasta to exist in its current state if he allowed it to exist at all. So it would seem like Emu gave Alabasta the benefit of the doubt, that Lily was not to blame. This was all a huge mistake. Lily couldn't have done something like that. So we'll let the Nefeltaris off for now because they're ultimately loyal to the world government. But also, as stated previously, I would suspect that the initial D wasn't something held by the entirety of the ancient kingdom. But much like the X in modern One Piece, the D was exclusive to those of Joy Boy's crew. And what this could imply is that every person with the initial D today is descended from a former member of the world's first pirate crew. So in addition to Nefeltari Lily, on Joy Boy's crew there could have been a monkey, a gull, a jaguar, a portgas, a Trafalgar, and however many other members there were. But then you ask the question, why a D? The X was chosen by the Straw Hats because it was a very stereotypical symbol of piracy. Crossbones X marks the spot, Yar and Mihawk and that sort of stuff. But that wouldn't necessarily have occurred to Joy Boy 800 years ago, as he was the world's very first pirate. There was no stereotypical set standard, and so the idea that I currently enjoy most is that the D represents a smile, the symbol of joy, and the very last thing that someone with the will of D does right before they die. And it gets crazier because in the modern day, what you do is you put the D and the X together and you get the XD emoji, which is like crazy levels of joy. But when I was going through all of those names before, there were two D families that I missed, those being the Marshalls and the Roxes. So according to this idea, there may have been a Judas on Joy Boy's crew, which is why we do have some evil Ds in the world, or even Judas's plural, Judai, if you will. Because we have both the Marshalls and the Roxes being less than upstanding members of society. And St. J. Garcia Satin comments directly on Blackbeard's lineage during Egghead Island. Katarina Devon claims that Marshall D. Teach is special, and St. Satin replies, as is his bloodline, which is a comment that he and the other elders haven't made about any other D-clan members. Although theoretically, as long as you know the meaning, you could masquerade as a Will of D member. So there might not be a traitor so much as there is a fake. And Dax Sake took this a step further by proposing that the Will of D could refer to a very specific character, being Davey, as in Davey Jones, a pirate who Oda obviously references with the Davey back fight. And the name itself could be a stupidly obvious explanation for how this tradition started. The Davey back fight is all about poaching crew members, so it could have been a game engineered to get Davey back after he'd been taken by another crew or something. I'm not so sure how I feel about this one though. I think that if the D does stand for a name like Davey, then it would have to be a case where Joy Boy's real name was Davey, which could make sense because Joy Boy did create what we now know of as the One Piece, hiding a vast treasure in the world in the same sort of way that Davey Jones hoarded his treasure in his locker at the bottom of the sea, which could also track because after finding out about the flooding, there is a renewed idea that Laugh Tale is somewhere underwater, and specifically somewhere that you can only get to by following the deep current, which the closer it takes you to the ocean floor, the slower it carries you, and Brooke claims that if you got caught in it, then you wouldn't see the light of day again for 2,000 years. So that's obviously a bit undesirable, but also it becomes one of the only reasonable places on this planet for Laugh Tale to be located. It's one of the last great remaining mysteries on this planet which no one can reach alive, at least not without the special secret that the Roger Pirates discovered. Now speaking of Roger, he was the keynote speaker for the Inherited Will conference. These things cannot be stopped. Inherited will, people's dreams, the ebb and flow of the ages. As long as people seek the answer to freedom, these will never cease to be. And at this point, it's important to note that Inherited Will is not exclusive to the Will of D. That's just the most prominent strain of Inherited Will we find in One Piece. But every Straw Hat has Inherited Will. Robin has the will of O'Hara, Chopper has the will of Dr. Hirolock, and Zoro has the will of Kuina. Plus, auxiliary characters also frequently display this inheritance as well, such as Carrot inheriting the will of Pedro, or Yamato desperately trying to claim the will of Kozuki Oden. And something that almost never gets mentioned is the very real concept of uninherited will, which was the title of chapter 625. This was the chapter where Queen Otohime protected St. Mosgard and begged the citizens of Fishman Island not to teach hate to their children. So One Piece isn't just about this fated force that runs non-consensually through generations. It's also about the decisions we make along the way to change or reinforce that will. In Otohime's case, she was able to change Mosgard's inherited will, a world noble of one of the 20 founding families. Her actions had the effect of uninheriting, if that is a verb, his inherited will, which to be fair, eventually resulted in Mosgard's execution, but not before he saved Princess Shirahoshi and changed the entire course of the planet as we know it. And that's what One Piece comes down to. A battle that started in ancient times, which Emu states has not ended to this very day. Because the combatants may have changed, but the struggle between the two prevailing strains of inherited will have not. And again, that sounds incredibly grand, yeah, fate of the world sort of stuff, but I do think it's infinitely simpler than that. For a will to be so powerful that it survived 8 centuries, we're not looking at a massive social, political, or geographical idea. All of those are fickle and crumble in the face of time. But what persists are core and simple ideas like friendship. And just as Luffy said on Alabasta when he and the crew marked themselves, no matter what happens from here on, our left arms will bear the sign of our fellowship. This is the sort of will that will endure no matter what. And so now I'm just patiently waiting for the day when we get a flashback panel of Joy Boy saying, no matter what happens from here on, our names will always bear the sign of our fellowship. Nefeltari Vivi is in big trouble because Monkey D. Dragon may be the most wanted person in the world, but Vivi is the most person wanted in the world by Emu, and that is a significantly worse title to carry. And what's going to happen from here has been forecast by attractive weather author Eiichiro Oda for literally over a decade now, with Emu's end goal being to marry Vivi. When I went back on all of Vivi's post-Alabasta appearances, I was shocked at just how blatant Eiichiro Oda has been here. And there's also a lot that's been lost in translation because English is not Japanese, and so I'll be referring to evidence provided by Dawn and Dusk, a native Japanese translator, and there will be a link to their channel in the description. But firstly, Vivi has a big problem. We're at the end of Egghead Island now. The Straw Hats are about to escape, at least at the time of this recording. By the time this video comes out, they may have already escaped, past tense. But they'll be heading to Elbaf and likely beyond the reach of the Marines. So the world government are going to need to find something else to occupy their time with, after which point their focus should shift to Vivi. Because Emu, he says very little and is potentially also very little. But one of the things he's made very clear and even commanded the elders to carry out is that he wants Vivi. Emu's desire for Vivi has been speculated ever since chapter 908, which was published 6 years ago now, and it introduced Emu holding a photo of Vivi. And from here, the internet went a little bit wild, suggesting very big picture stuff like how Emu needed her in order to gain control of Pluton, remembering that this was before we knew it was below Wano and still thought it was on Alabasta. But there was one lone Redditor who was able to pierce the dark cloud of fan theories and get a clear vision of the future. What if Emu's just a regular dude and he finds Vivi exceptionally hot? And as it turns out, that's the closest that anyone got to the real answer. In fact, this here crudely drawn gif predicted the future better than every professional One Piece theorist combined. But why does Emu want the Vivi? Sure, you can say it's because she looks like Lily and Emu is obsessed with Lily, but does it go deeper than that? And does Vivi perhaps have a connection to Lily beyond that of a simple descendant and more like Luffy's connection to Joy Boy? The answer is maybe, very maybe. And I'll tell you why in a bit, but we need to focus on Emu first. Because what does he actually plan on doing with Vivi if he gets her? Well, a clue to this can be found within the concept of the empty throne itself, a symbolic object designed to maintain peace amongst the world government nations, enforcing a sense of equality, as none of them need to bow to any single seated entity. This was of course a clever ruse, and it's very interesting to think about how Emu ended up being the person to plant their silhouetted buttocks on the empty throne, considering that there would have been at least 18 other contenders, not counting the Nefeltari family who said, nah mate. But in Japanese, the empty throne is named the Kara no Gyokuza, with the first kanji within that name also being able to form the word Gyomu, meaning nothingness and nihility. So we're not talking empty like, oh no, my tomato sauce bottle is empty, however will I eat assorted cooked potatoes now? Dry and unlubricated? I think think not, sir. What we're talking about is emptiness on a much more deep and existential level. And the idea being proposed is that this is a pun. It's not just about the throne being symbolically to display equal power within the world government, it's also commentary on Emu's state of being. He himself is profoundly empty, and even though he's ruling the world, what good is it when everyone he becomes close to eventually dies and leaves him with nothing? Emu is a fundamentally lonely being, so I think, rather tragically, what he wants is a friend. You know, those things that One Piece is all about. He wants a Nakama of his own. And so it's very possible that Emu wants Vivi in order to make her immortal and live out his eternal Lily dreams with her. To not have this second chance at Lily slip through the vast cracks of death once more. Because Emu is obsessed with Lily to the point where, even though she's dead, I think she still has a fairly good case to take out a restraining order on him. But why has he waited for Vivi? There have been so many Nefeltari families, like say Nefeltari Titi, who looked a lot like Lily as well. Although that does bring up the potentially awkward question of who exactly was the descendant of Lily? Was it Cobra or was it Titi? Because at the moment it feels like Alabasta has some, how shall we say, close family ties. Which is not at all helped by that one time that King Cobra spied on his daughter in the bath. May he rest in perverted peace. But as alluded to before, the answer could actually lie more in Luffy. Up until recently, Emmett didn't actually make any distinction between Luffy and Joy Boy. He saw Luffy and he called him Joy Boy, which began to refuel the theories that they are indeed the same person. However, Emmett did eventually distinguish between them and was officially introduced to Monkey D. Luffy. However, he did mention that Luffy and Joy Boy look pretty much exactly alike, almost like some sort of reincarnation. The reincarnation part are my words, not his. But the same thing appears to be happening with Emu and Vivi. Just as Emmett saw Luffy and thought, mate, Joy Boy, Emu has seen Vivi and thought, mate, Lily. And it's probably not just a coincidence that there are at least two people in the modern day carrying the faces of ancient citizens. We could even make it 3 if we could jam Ryuma into the timeline because he looks exactly like Zoro. And also there's a solid argument to be made that Shirahoshi could be a mirror image of the ancient mermaid princess. We just haven't had anyone who knew her able to confirm that as of yet, except for potentially Emu, who really did not take kindly to the visage of Shirahoshi and stabbed her photo in the Chamber of Flowers. But it really does seem like a lot of people from these ancient times are suddenly converging 800 years later. Whether it be mirror image reincarnations or just people who have been alive that long like Emmett, Zunesha, and Emu. But ultimately, it would appear that ever since the Alabasta, Oda has been setting Vivi up for a wedding. First thing about this, as a note on the Chamber of Flowers that Emu usually occupies, the kind of flowers that Emu keeps in there are known as Kala Lily, which is unlikely to be a coincidence given his lily obsession, but these flowers are typically used for weddings because they're all lovely and white, in keeping with the traditional Western bride dress aesthetic. But also, the Kala Lily symbolizes life and fertility. But also, because flowers are weird, they also symbolize the exact not that as well. The Kala Lily is also a very classic symbol of death, and so you'll often see them scattered around funerals as well. Which is very fitting because essentially what we have is Emu planting lilies to mourn Lily and potentially to wed Vivi, who herself has been shown tending to a lily for her sick father. And to go even further back, when Crocodile of all characters was introduced on Alabasta, we saw his hand suckling all of the moisture out of a lily, symbolically displaying what he was doing to the nation of Alabasta. Granted, the other two were not color lilies, but still, it's pretty clear that Oda has been sitting on this lily idea for quite some time. He's not just picking flowers at random. In fact, I'd say he's been thinking about Lily almost as long as Emu has. And to this, I need to go back to the thesis that everything Oda needed to set up the end of One Piece was given to us by the conclusion of the first quarter of the series, by the end of Skypiea, because he had no idea how long the series was going to run, but he needed all of the pieces in place for the ending to occur at whatever point it was that he decided to implement it, which we're still waiting for. But that's why you can look back on Alabasta and see the Lily motifs and be like, right, this all makes perfect sense. Lily wasn't a character that Oda thought up like a decade or two down the line. She was in mind right here, right from the get-go. And the rest of the series up to this point has been setting Vivi up for this idea. For example, on the cover of chapter 610, Vivi is on all fours and all floors, surrounded by cats meticulously scrubbing to get those Alabasta baths sparkling clean, and one of the cats is holding a sign that says bride training. So what's happening here is that a squad of cats are putting Vivi through wife boot camp. And I should say that this isn't part of a canon cover story. This was part of the Oda art request series that usually happens between cover stories, and usually these drawings are bizarre and surreal requests made by readers, but on this occasion, Oda took a request from his former editor, Akira Jean-Baptiste Hattori, also known as the notoriously pervy editor, and the one who served Oda through the Amazon Lily arc, encouraging purging and unleashing previously unseen 2D manga desires. I bring that up to both credit and discredit this image. So firstly, to discredit it, Hattori is again notorious, and this might have just been something that he wanted to see. It's very possible. But to give the image credit, Hattori again was Oda's editor, meaning that he knew what most of the endgame One Piece twists were going to be. So if he knew that there was a dude called Emu who was going to try and marry Vivi, then he may have seen this as a very clever way to foreshadow that. And look, if this was just one instance and I would just push it aside and go, no, he was probably just jacking off. But I believe that it might be more because of other things, as after the Alabasta arc, Vivi's entire world has been very wedding-centric. Whether it's being proposed to by an eel or having Karoo carve a statue of her in a wedding dress, or most blatantly, in chapter 823, Cobra says that he's gathered piles of pictures of potential suitors to become the future Mr. Nefeltari Vivi, and she says to toss them all out. The last thing that King Cobra wanted to do before he died was to find Vivi a husband, and he failed because she wouldn't have any of it. And granted, I am cherry-picking evidence here because there are also artworks of Vivi and Karoo playing doubles at what appears to be the Alabasta Open, but I would never say that this is foreshadowing that Vivi is going to become a pro tennis player, because stuff like that is a one-off. Vivi's tennis ambitions are not a motif. The wedding stuff, however, does keep coming up both inside and outside of the story, and I think that whether she likes it or not, Vivi is almost certainly going to be attending her own wedding in the future, but first Emu needs to take her away from the big bird blimp. How is he going to do this? Well, this may have been quite bluntly foreshadowed as well. Also in chapter 823, the Alabasta party departs their nation for the reverie, with Vivi planting herself in the crow's nest, and Igram gets all worried about Vivi as he often does, and he yells, "What if a great monstrous bird should appear and snatch you away?" Which is a line that I've brought up before because this did kind of happen when Vivi eventually absconded with Big News Morgans. So you could say that a monstrous bird appeared and it did snatch Vivi away. Fantastic force skinning by Eiichiro Oda there. But also, this is one of those situations where English is insufficient to convey the true meaning. The word Igram uses for this monstrous bird in Japanese is kaicho, literally meaning mystery or wonder bird. And kaicho also happens to be how the Itsumade is described, the yokai creature that St. Marcus Mars literally is according to his introduction box. So this could be foreshadowing for Marcus Mars to come in and snatch Vivi away from the blimp. And realistically, who else could currently capture Vivi in this state? The Marines have no capability of reaching the sheer heights of Big News Bird, so if Emu really wants that there Vivi, then Marcus Mars is just the right kaicho for the job. And Dawn and Dusk pointed out something that I really liked, which is that each of the 5 elders have domain over certain thematic islands. For example, Saint Saturn was sent to Egghead Island because he's the warrior god of science and defense, so Egghead was very much within his sphere of authority, whereas Alabasta would fall under the domain of a different elder, and that elder is likely Marcus Mars himself. Marcus Mars is the warrior god of the environment, and Alabasta is the arc with the most focus on the environment. They fought a whole war over rain, and one of the most enduring themes was how the citizens both fought against and lived with the desert, and it even ended with Koza becoming the newly appointed environmental minister. So Mars would be the most appropriate elder to be a real pain in the dick to Alabasta. Like Saturn being relentless with Vegapunk, Mars is the bane of the Nefeltari family and the nation of Alabasta. But this brings us to Emu's selfishness. Emu's desires are quite selfish, emotionally driven, and may not be appreciated by those adjacent to power. Because imagine if you, random person viewing this, may be on the toilet. You're desperately trying to keep command of a global empire which is threatening to collapse all around you, and all the king of said empire can think about is satisfying his 800-year-old urges with a blue-haired girl. You probably wouldn't be too thrilled. And this would be prime time for, a spot of mutiny, and you know what? Here's an interesting thing about that. During his message, Vegapunk specifically refers to the alliance of 20 kingdoms as a Rengogun, which was the same word used to describe the alliance of Luffy, Capone Gang Beige, and Caesar Gangster Gastino on Whole Cake Island. Whereas almost every other time an alliance is formed in One Piece, such as the Ninja Pirate Mink Samurai Alliance, or Big Mom and Kaido forming an alliance, the term Oda uses is Dome. The nuance between these two words is very subtle even in Japanese. They can be used more or less interchangeably. However, the way Oda uses Rengogun is in the way of a sudden alliance born out of desperation and opportunity, rather than a well thought out and planned goal. Rengogun is generally used for groups with weaker bonds, and ones that tend to return to a state of enemies after their survival is ensured. And given that that is how the 20 kingdoms were described, you do have to wonder if there was a great internal power struggle after the ancient kingdom were defeated, because then you've got 19 kings, each firmly believing in their right to rule, and yet only one ended up sitting on that throne. The world government does not share power equally, no matter what it publicly simply states. And this opens up the door for a lot of ancient bitterness. Perhaps one or even a couple of families have been pulling a bit of a Kurozumi and plotting some revenge for their fallen ancestors. Although right now I can only really point to the Figurland family, who do seem to be outcasts of the world noble systems, at least the Figurlands we've met so far. And given their power, I'd say they'd be in a pretty amazing spot to enact some delicious betrayal. But what all of this boils down to is also Luffy. As I've said multiple times in the past, and will say many more times in the future, our boy is not a hero. In fact, he's never even fought against the world government if one of his friends hasn't been in danger. Luffy has no real reason to fight the world government otherwise, because they weren't actively trying to reach Laugh Tale, find the One Piece, and stop his dream. So if we did want to set up, one last huge conflict between a Luffy and a world government, then Luffy needs something or someone to fight for. And Vivi is a great candidate for that, especially since after Luffy heard about the Reverie events, he declared that they were going to Alabasta and then Marijois before being talked out of it, because he would drop everything in an instant to save Vivi, or attend her wedding, or perhaps both. Both are quite likely, and thus what we have happening is the modern day version of the struggle that Joy Boy and Lily faced against Emu, this time featuring a Luffy and a Vivi. After almost 2 decades, Franky's father has finally been revealed, and that man is a queen. God save the queen. So I didn't plan on making this video ever, but Story Lord Eiichiro Oda has kicked my attention right in the nutsack with this disturbingly casual revelation of an already fairly disturbing familial connection. So for anyone who isn't aware, perhaps blissfully unaware, this information comes courtesy of the latest batch of One Piece Vivia cards, which is a sort of living data book where new cards get added every couple of months, and often characters get replaced with new cards, many of which contain information that Oda didn't see fit to slot into the actual story somewhere. And this time we have a huge cast of characters with their own bombshells to go through, like Shanks, Mihawk, Crocodile, Buggy, Vivi, and a surprisingly funny one about Hera, Big Mom's replacement cloud homie. But the leading story here is Queen and his relationship to Franky. So firstly, Queen isn't actually Queen's real name. And as much as I so desperately wanted his real name to be something like Freddie Mercury, it's actually Cyan, as in the first 5 letters of the English word science, and not at all the first and only 5 letters of the also English word cyan. English is a difficult language, and I promise that I will never insult French again, much. On Queen's card, his least favorite food is listed as anything low calorie. His hobby is collecting photos of Komurasaki because he's a creep, and most importantly, we have a timeline of his major life events. 39 years ago, Queen started working with Mads alongside Vegapunk, Caesar Clown, Vince Smoke Judge, and the soon-to-be cloned Miss Bucky Stussy. And this alone is fascinating because it finally gives us a solid timeline for Mads. Up until now, we weren't quite sure when they'd been operating, but according to this, Mads were a group for 13 years, which is a long time to spend with Caesar Clown. The founding date is actually very important though, because this puts the founding of Mads in the same time period as the God Valley incident, which apparently occurred 38 years ago, meaning that Stussy at one point was somehow both part of Mads and the Rocks Pirates 39 years ago, because we know from Kaido's Vivia card that the Rocks Pirates were active for about 6 years. But essentially, Mads was founded during the peak of Rocks Pirates' reign. And it's very possible that Stussy was kinda sort of betraying them by collecting the DNA of her crewmates to use in the early Mads cloning experiments, which resulted in the creation of Edward Weevil. Now, as for how Miss Buckingham Stussy got Whitebeard's DNA for this Weevil, use your imagination or use RedTube or something, that's how it happened. But 3 years after Mads was founded, Queen had a bit of a side gig when he became a parent. 36 years ago, an entity specifically defined as Queen's son was born, and 36 years ago also happens to be the exact same year that Franky was born. Now, if that's all the information we had, I wouldn't be making this video. It gets a lot crazier. 3 years after this son was born, Queen received an offer to join Kaido. However, he either ignored or declined this offer and remained working with Mads for another 4 years before ultimately deciding to leave the group. Now, here is the tricky thing. Queen did not leave Mads in order to join the Beast Pirates. Joining the Beast Pirates happens way later. So there's actually another unknown reason why Queen left Mads and took his family on the road for 3 years before eventually 26 years ago, according to his timeline, deciding to abandon his son and join Kaido, approximately 7 years after Kaido's initial offer. And this is where the coincidence gets a bit too wild to ignore, because Queen abandoned his son 26 years ago, which is again the exact same year that Franky was abandoned by his parents, then made his way to Scrap Heap Island and was taken in by Tom. Franky's parents were also said to be pirates, pirates, which Queen likely became after leaving Mads. There was that gap period where we don't quite know what Queen was doing, but he definitely did become a pirate after abandoning Franky to join Kaido. Furthermore, Franky's exceptional engineering was not taught to him by Tom. 10-year-old Franky already came with this knowledge, and even at the age of, again, 10, I said that, Franky was already extremely adept at creating deadly weapons out of scrap, which is how Tom discovered him, and weaponry engineering just so happens to be a specialty of that there Queen. Also, they're both cyborgs, and again, it wasn't Tom who taught Franky how to cyborgify himself after being hit by a train. Franky just somehow knew how to do this. Tom and Iceberg and all of the everyone else on Water 7 were shipwrights. Their skill set was boats and trains, whereas Franky's skill set has always been more in the area of scientific engineering and applying that to ships and trains. And it makes a disturbing amount of sense to think that Franky may have observed his father, Queen, modifying his body over time, and so when it became necessary, Franky understood the basics of how to build himself a body, as well as how to create his series of Battle Franky. Both Franky and Queen also have an affinity for music and dancing. Both are also very out there personalities who are frequently described as perverts, and each of them just continue to modify their bodies to get bigger and bigger. They even go so far as to share the same blood type, being XF, which is the second rarest blood type in One Piece behind SO, which was Fisher Tiger's blood type, and the reason why none of his crew could give him a transfusion. And it's also been noted that Volume 93 could be an homage to the exact reverse-numbered Volume 39, featuring Luffy and Zoro in the same positions with Queen striking Franky's pose. This is the point where men on the internet say that there are too many things lining up here. It is absolutely ridiculous, but at the moment, it just fits. With, of course, one very important question to answer, which is how come Franky didn't recognize his daddy on Wano? He wasn't abandoned as a baby. Franky was 10 years old and would definitely remember his father. It's difficult to forget a parent with Queen's aesthetics, and equally worthy of questionment is why Queen didn't recognize Franky, his child. We're going to start with the latter question because that is extremely easy to answer, so much so that it really does seem planned by Oda, because during the raid on Onigashima, we see Queen whip out his bounty posters of the straw hat that he keeps on hand for reasons, and he lingers on Zoro and Sanji particularly catching his eye because of the Vinsmoke name. Sanji's true name revealed his identity, as true names often do. In fact, it's what they're designed for. But that's the thing about Franky. We've been calling him Franky for so long that many fans forget that his real name is Cutty Flam, and also that he's not even pictured in his own bounty poster. It's currently an image of the Thousand Sunny, but during Wano, Franky's bounty had a photo of Franky Shogun. So for argument's sake, let's say that Franky was Queen's son. In that case, there is absolutely nothing that could indicate that to Queen, because Cutty Flam now uses a new name, and on his bounty poster, there's a new photo that's not him. There's no way Queen could have recognized him. And the same thing goes for Queen, by the way. He wasn't always such a rotund gent. This is the culmination of the ultimate big boy science, and given that Franky wouldn't have seen Queen for 26 years by now, my guess is that Queen looked a lot more normal at that 26-year mark than he did on Wano. And also, again, Queen isn't his real name. Queen took on that title after he joined Kaido, which was after he abandoned his son. Queen's real name is Cyan, which is something that is never mentioned during Wano. So Franky, yes, he was on Wano and he could hear ever so many things about this man named Queen, but that's all completely meaningless to him. So I did actually go back and go through all of Franky's parts on Wano, which is actually a surprisingly easy thing to do because he's not in much of the arc. But I had to do it because I could have sworn that Queen and Franky had been in the same room before. And they are on just one occasion, which is when the Straw Hats gather on the performance floor. It's the part where Franky gloriously drives his motorcycle into Big Mom's face and then looks like an emperor slaying boss as Nami swoons over him. This is the only opportunity that Franky had to see Queen and vice versa. After this, Franky hops into Franky Shogun and then runs off in the hallway to deal with Sasuke. What I want to say is that logically the performance floor is like the size of a sports arena. Onigashima is massive, and it's completely reasonable that two people can be in this arena-sized space and not realize each other's existence. That's how real life would work, but the issue is that we're talking about anime and manga. And if it was important, there is nothing, no matter how improbable or illogical, that would stop two characters locking eyes. That's the only flaw with this idea, in my opinion, and it might just be that way because Oda didn't want to explore Franky's heritage because there was already so much going on during Wano. Like how he didn't see the need to flesh out Zoro's family roots and instead revealed all of that information in an SBS. Sort of like how this revelation is coming from a Vivia card. Another question that does pop up is that sure, Franky and Queen never really had a chance to interact on Wano, but Franky has interacted with other members of Mads. Vegapunk and Caesar Clown to be precise, and if Franky was the son of Queen, it would be likely that he'd remember them or that they'd remember him. Franky was 6 to 7 when Queen left Mads, which is definitely old enough to remember these wacky weirdos, but at the same time it's also possible possible that Queen just never took his son to work. Most scientists don't bring their spawn into their deadly lab experiments. So that's another, question I would have. And so, look, I'd like to investigate other options. In which case, the question I would have immediately is, if it's not Franky, and Queen both produced and abandoned a son in the exact same 2 years that Franky was both born and abandoned, then why mention it at all? To be clear, these Vivia cards usually don't go super into depth with these characters. They're usually more of a collection of information we already know in a centralized location, so that you don't have to scan over 1,100 chapters to find everything. But that's why information like this sticks out. It's not miscellaneous flavor text like, say, characters' favorite foods. And extra details like this aren't just written by random people. This is information from Oda himself. And you would think that if he went out of his way to add this, then it would be referring to at least a character of relevance. So how many men, apart from Franky, were born 36 years ago? Well, we have Kumadori, who I can kind of see being related to Queen actually, but it's unlikely because CP9 agents are usually taken and raised from birth. Then we also have Smoker, who happens to have been born 36 years ago. Interestingly, it says he was born in the Grand Line. I say that because we know he saw Roger's execution in Logtown as a child. So at some point during his very small days, he moved from the Grand Line to East Blue. Perhaps he was abandoned in East Blue. And Roger's execution did take place 2 years after Queen abandoned his son. And the last thing I'll say for this connection is that both Queen and Smoker love their cigars. But then there's my favorite fun option, which is that Damaru Black, aka fake Luffy and now fake Eustace Kid, also fits the timeline. And I wouldn't be at all disappointed if he was the child of Queen who ended up achieving a similar level of roundosity. I'm always keen to add to the mythology of Damaru Black, so I would eagerly buy it. Absalom was also born in the same year and certainly shares Queen's obsession with singular female targets. And then finally we have Vito of the Fire Tank Pirates, who I guess he likes really big guns, and so does Queen. I don't think any of them are stronger candidates than Franky though. You can definitely make a reasonable argument for a couple of them, but with Franky, I mean, almost everything lines up in terms of the timeline, the skills, and personality. The only thing missing from the picture are these questions about character interactions. And I've also briefly considered that it could be Edward Weevil, and that maybe he's a lot less Whitebeard than Buckingham Stussy would want us to believe. And Weevil, he's almost perfect, but he was born after the year that Queen's son was born. I mean, born and or created, I don't know, what do you call it when clone? Whatever happened with Weevil, it happened a year after Queen's son. Maybe that's a discrepancy. I still wouldn't rule out Weevil or maybe another clone that we haven't met. But until further notice, I'm still very much on the Franky train here, which might be a bit insensitive given his history with trains, but I must still do it. And that was just one of the things that these Vivia cards revealed. Mihawk got a new card which listed his place of origin as unspecified, which is incredibly unusual because even the most mysterious of origins like Buggy and Shanks have been revealed, as they were born in West Blue and the Grand Line respectively. So I'm wondering if this means that simply giving away Mihawk's birthplace would reveal too much. Perhaps he wasn't born in any sea, for example. Maybe he was born up at the Red Line and Marijois and has world noble heritage. Every world noble we've logged so far has listed their origin as Marijois, which is one of the only origin points that differentiates from the 7 seas of the One Piece world. Another one would be Punk Hazard, which pops up in the rare case of created beings like the Numbers. But I don't know, I'm looking at Mr. Mihawk and I'm thinking that he could have been a world noble or going way out there, perhaps even a Mads clone of an even greater legendary swordsman. Probably not the latter, I'm definitely betting more on world noble, which has been suspected for quite some time now because Mihawk's eyes are quite similar to Emu's eyes, but more people tend to be focused on Mihawk's card stating that he has observation and armament haki, but there is still nothing confirming that he has Conqueror's haki yet. As always, I find it incredibly hard to believe that he doesn't. There has never and will never be a greater conqueror in this world than Mihawk. In his chosen field, he has nothing left to conquer. He's so bored that he's waiting for someone to challenge him. And so, we wait also. We also have big information from a very unexpected place because Hera, Big Mom's cloud homie, made to replace Zeus, as a Vivia card now which lists her birthday. And that's usually very benign information. However, we all happen to be there on Hera's birthday, narratively midwifing as she was born. Her birthday is on March 17th, meaning that the raid on Onigashima officially took place on March 17th. And given that the Straw Hats reunited on Sabari Archipelago between February 4th and 6th, this means that the entirety of post-time skip One Piece has covered just under 6 weeks of in-world time. Or actually, I should say that it took less than 6 weeks to go all the way from Sabari to the end of Wano. During Egghead, time has passed. I believe we're now in early April. And I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this in other videos, but I believe the reason for this timeline is because Oda wants One Piece to end either on or near Luffy's birthday, which is the 5th of May. I strongly believe that Luffy will either become the Pirate King or achieve his dream beyond beyond that on his birthday. And something I need to add about Hera is that her card says that her favorite food is Zeus, which I just think is really funny. And while we're on some of the more comedy reveals, Oda has stated that if Buggy and Shanks had jobs in the real world, then they would be a factoring manager and landscape photographer respectively. Elsewhere, Beppo's bounty has been raised from 500 berries to 1,500 berries, still not the lowest in the series because Chopper is only 1,000 berries. And here's a funky one, Crocodile's hobby is apparently mushroom hunting. Mushroom hunting. That one I only bring up because sometimes characters' hobbies are weirdly relevant, like Blackbeard's archaeology hobby, which seems so out of character when it was revealed, but with what we know now is very much in line with his level of knowledge about the ancient world. And we have some more Straw Hat news to do with Vivi, because as listed on her Vivi account, she is labeled as a former Straw Hat. Very sad, because spiritually I still include her as part of the crew, especially since she has her own motif number, which is also listed on the card. Motif numbers. Every Straw Hat has a motif number, which generally denotes the order in which they join the crew. And Vivi's motif number is 5.5, meaning that she is considered to have joined the crew after Sanji and before Chopper, which I've always found interesting. It very easily could have been 6.5 after Alabasta, but it looks like we're counting her as an official crew member or an official former crew member from Whiskey Peak on. And apparently Vivi also sleeps between 10 p.m. and 10 a.m. This is 12 hours of sleep. It's so much sleep, it's counterproductive. She definitely sleeps like a princess. In Cypher Poll news, it's been confirmed that Guernica is dead. He's the CP0 agent who interrupted Luffy vs. Kaido, and also the man responsible for taking Luffy's Gear 5th bounty image. So apparently, right after he took that photo, Guernica succumbed to his Kaido wounds and died. Meaning that I think Guernica is the only person that Kaido successfully killed during his whole tenure as a main antagonist. At least in the modern day. He did some bad stuff in the past. But also, Guernica's name is spelled differently than I thought. It's actually spelled Guernica with a K, as in Guernica, as in Nika, as in the sun god Nika, which I find very interesting considering that it's Guernica's fault that Luffy awakened his devil fruit and took on the Nika form in the first place. And also, take this for what you will, but Guernica's card also lists him as the world's strongest special grade agent, although at the moment it's a bit vague on whether this is listing Guernica as the most powerful CP0 agent or simply referring to CP0 as a group. I personally believe it's the latter, and there's just a lot of weird translations floating around. Either way, he's dead now, so it doesn't hugely matter. And in case you missed it, Tama also appears in this set for the first time with her full name, Kurozumi Tama. So she's a member of Orochi's clan, and this was officially revealed in the SBS of Volume 105. But look, if you're not a strange man on the internet obsessed with fictional pirates, then I definitely don't expect you to keep up with all of that, so here it is in case you missed it. And also, you let me know in the comments what you think about the ever so insane idea of Queen being Franky's father. Mad Monk Urouge is the final worst generation member to explore, and Eiichiro Oda has saved the best for last. As a sky citizen, Urouge has the answers to the great mysteries of the world, and in fact, all this time, he's had a huge head start on us, with his ambition potentially directly tying into the dawn of the world and the discovery of the hidden earth below, or as the sky people refer to it, the discovery of endless Verth. This video was inspired by Daksake, who made a great video about the Urouge and El connection, as well as their potential future on Elbaf. However, I have come to a very different conclusion. And I think that recent revelations have made Urouge's ambition and future in the story quite clear. Because while Eiichiro Oda never had real plans to explore any of the supernovas when he first created them, they have been masterfully weaved into the narrative, and just like I said before, we have saved the best for last. So at face value, Urouge has all of the makings of a potential antagonist, starting with his crew, the fallen monk pirates. Now this could be quite literal due to falling from the sky down to the blue sea. However, generally this sort of terminology is used to indicate a loss of and or rejection of faith. The faith of the sky people being the sun god as well as other assorted gods over there. During Nolan's flashback, we discover that the Skypians hundreds of years ago worshipped at least 4 gods: rain, forest, earth, and most importantly, the sun god, who is specifically mentioned by Moose as the one she's going to be sacrificed for and gets to go and visit. Lucky her. Now something has clearly gone a little bit awry here over time with the human sacrifices and such. The concept of Nika has probably been a bit diluted, but also it's important to note that Urouge is not from Shandia or Skypiea. He's from a different island that we'll get to in a bit. But that different island has a much stronger connection to Nika. At this point, the point is that, as presented to us, Urouge has fallen and may have lost his faith in the sun god. And the fallen nature is also also quite evident in Urouge's flagship, the Hanjimaru, the figurehead of which is a colossal oni face with wings and a large monk bead necklace, almost as if it's designed to represent the true nature of Urouge under the mask that is his perpetual smile, hiding a more sinister demonic presence. Very anti-faith. And broken faith is an idea that persists quite strongly with Urouge, and you can see it most evidently with his encounters with other beings that claim to be gods. Urouge is the first worst generation member to have the unfortunality of crossing paths with St. Charlos on Sabari, and I think it's quite clever on the part of Oda to use Urouge in this way, as what we have here is a man of faith coming into contact with a man who claims the authority of a god. And in the face of a man who claims to be a god, a heretic if you will, Urouge saw this and told his crew, parading like that through this lawless land is cause for trouble. We'll just have to kneel and let them pass. And that's a difficult idea to come to terms with. A man of such strong faith willingly kneeling before another man sort of thing claiming to be a god. Furthermore, St. Charles proceeds to shoot a dude and abducts his fiancée into a lifetime of sexual slavery. Urouge just stands there smiling and saying, well, they do as they please. Basically accepting the authority of a world noble, and acknowledging that said authority trumps his beliefs or lack thereof. Meanwhile, Zoro was the one who attempted to take action against St. Charlos, a disciple of Luffy, the sun god, and this is perhaps a green-headed sign from the heavens that Urouge maybe should plonk himself back on the right path. It's just there, you can see it, go walk on it. And Zoro is a disciple whose life was saved by Jewelry Bonnie, another devout follower of Nika. It's very interesting that it was those three who were chosen to confront a god, because as a result we get to see all three of their fates in action. Zoro, who completely rejects the concept of gods being the one arguably on the most correct path, then Bonnie, who has faith in Nika conspiring with fate to save Zoro, and then on the side over there is Urouge doing nothing. And to explain this lack of action, we need to dive into Urouge's connection with Enel. It's heavily speculated that Urouge is Birkin, and this is due to his wing shape, because there are three tribes of sky people that we currently know of: the Shandians, the Skypians, and the Birkins, with Urouge's wings matching the third one. And Birka also happens to be the island where Enel was born, and the one that subsequently got destroyed by him 8 years ago. The reason why it was destroyed is because the Birkins did not accept Enel as a god. The Birkins believed unwaveringly in their OG deity, which was likely the sun god Nika. And McKinley during Skypiea states that Birka had a quote powerful sky knight that was no match for Enel, which may very well have been Mad Monk Urouge, who was defeated by Enel and cast down to the Blue Sea, thus becoming a literal fallen monk. And Enel may be one of the few people capable of actually defeating Urouge in battle combat, because due to his devil fruit abilities, in order to bring down Urouge, you need to take him down ideally in a single hit. Otherwise, Urouge will simply absorb the damage and dish it back out as part of his karmic punishment technique. And even pre-time skip, defeating Urouge in one hit was practically impossible to accomplish. It took a kick from a Marine Admiral to put Urouge into blissful pain sleep. And Enel is capable of one-shotting most pre-time skip characters who aren't made of rubber, which makes things very interesting when Urouge ends up outside of Raijin Island in the New World, and for the first time to this point, he stops smiling, potentially because he is all too aware of the power of lightning, and instead he meets an elderly woman named Casa, who offers him an umbrella. And I only point this out because her name Casa literally means umbrella. So Urouge is being offered an umbrella by an umbrella. She also reminds me a lot of Amazon, who the Straw Hats met on the way to Skypiea, and not in a good way, because I'm very wary of hospitable old women in One Piece, because they generally have a plan to extort you of all of your cash monies. But this adds to the element of broken faith. Urouge on Birka may have fought for his beliefs, and he lost. The sun god didn't step in to save Birka or bless Urouge with the power to do so himself, and so Urouge was left with no option but to respect the power of lightning because it trumped his beliefs, as well as respect the power of the world nobles on Sabari because Urouge had learned a lesson about standing up to those who claim to be gods. The lesson being that whether they are gods or not, they often have the horrifying power to back that claim up. And so Urouge's views may have changed quite radically, and even led him in the direction of the direct antithesis of Nika, being one nefarious Blackbeard. Curiously, Urouge has mentioned Blackbeard once in the past in relation to the outcome of the Paramount War. The key here is Blackbeard. He's going to be the eye of the storm for some time to come. So this is either very precise language or an incredibly coincidentally perfect metaphor from Urouge, because the Will of D are traditionally associated with storms in One Piece and causing storms. And while everyone else is now aware of Blackbeard at this point, Urouge seems to be pretty much the only person in the world other than Shanks Shanks, who truly sees Blackbeard for the threat he is and the position he holds. And my guess as to why Urouge was able to identify that so early is because he may have secret Will of D knowledge. Whatever it may be, Urouge sees something in Blackbeard, a good thing or a bad thing that he thinks is good. Because if Urouge thinks that the sun god has forsaken him and doomed his island, then it makes an unfortunate amount of sense to turn to the enemy of the sun being the darkness. And his epithet Mad Monk adds to this because mad, generally not a good thing, and denotes an individual that you really don't want to spend too much time around. Although epithets are not everything. Thinking about it, Massacre Soldier Killer and Surgeon of Death Trafalgar Law, they turned out to be pretty decent guys after all. But the Mad Monk epithet also immediately conjures thoughts of Rasputin, which doesn't immediately make anyone think, oh, ally. But to be completely fair, that is just the Western perspective. And it's not the one that we should be so keen to cling on to. Because to me, it's far more likely that Urouge's epithet is based on the Chinese Mad Monk Jigong, who is usually described as more of an eccentric drunk who is almost always seen smiling. Much more akin to Luffy's Gear 5th eccentricity, always doing weird stuff, but for the sake of positive outcomes. And so this is the turning point for Urouge. Because while I do think there are a lot of signs that point to him being a man of broken faith and a strong potential antagonist, I think there is a much better argument to be made for the exact opposite. So first, let's redefine Burka, because during NL's cover story, we discover that the ancient moon city he explores was also named Burka, so the Burka that NL destroyed could more accurately be described as New Burka, the settled location after the Sky People migrated from the moon. And one of the reasons why I'm so insistent on Burka having knowledge of Nika is because this civilization seems to have been powered by the Mother Flame, which is present in the hieroglyphics, as well as within their infrastructure, which NL substitutes with his electricity. And they left the moon to settle on the blue planet in search of resources, which remains the dream of every Sky person to this very day. There's a part during the Skypiea arc where Luffy, Sanji, and Usopp are exploring the Sky Town, and they come across a curious statue made of Verth, which Conus explains, that's Verth. To the inhabitants of the sky, it's an object of eternal admiration. It's what the entire war in the sky was fought over. Who gets to command that holy part of Jaya Island that got heaved up into the sky? And it was the desire that fueled Enel's terror. Because Upper Yard was not enough for him. His dream was to find the legendary Endless Verth, which is also known as Fairy Verth, depending on which translation you read or watch. But they're both technically correct because the kanji for it means endless, but the furigana reading on top of the kanji is the English word fairy. So it's a cross-cultural kanji fun pun. Either way, this was a mythical landmass that NL dreamt of finding, which is why he built the Arc Maxim to go to the moon, thinking that the Endless Verth could only be in the upper domain of the gods. However, with recent revelations, I think it is beyond likely that the Endless Verth is actually a reference to the One Piece world before it flooded, because that's what the planet would have looked like from the moon to the Sky People who migrated there. A big bowl of Endless Verth. And in case anyone hasn't put two and two together by now, Verth is just Earth with a V on the front, so it makes a lot of sense that Endless Verth is referring to the planet itself. And yes, Earth does have a secondary meaning being in the soil in the land and such, but we probably wouldn't call it Earth if it wasn't on Earth, I think. I mean, for example, if and when we do colonize Mars, do you think we're still going to refer to their land as Earth? Absolutely no way. What we're going to do, we're going to pick up a handful of crap and we're going to call it a pile of Marses. And to bring this back to Urouge, he may actually have a very similar dream to Enel, given that this is the quote, object of eternal admiration to the inhabitants of the sky. So his goal could also be to seek out the legendary Endless Verth, to do the exact same thing as Enel was doing, but Urouge had a different approach, choosing instead to go down and search the Blue Sea. And they may even have had something of a falling out, because there is a bit of a fun crack theory that Urouge was originally Enel's fifth priest, which is propagated almost entirely by this page, where Luffy, Usopp, and Sanji are sailing into the trials, and it looks like there used to be 5 trial doors, with this door on the left having been destroyed. The idea being that Urouge took a stand against Enel and either refused to accept or even renounced him as a god. And so Enel destroyed any trace of Urouge, obviously including his priest trial door. And while I think this is a fun idea, it is 99.9% not the case, because I believe the trial doors are made to resemble a classic Buddhist palm, like this. So that destroyed door is just a little nub of the thumb popping and up. And really, what would Urouge's ordeal be anyway? Given his hobby of love making, it would probably be very similar to Sanji's quote, ordeal of love, which may very well have been the most challenging of the 5 for Luffy, Usopp, and Sanji to overcome. But I think there's a very solid chance that Urouge purposely went down to the Blue Sea to search for the Endless Earth. And it's probably a desire he's had since he was a child, because we do have one image of a very young Urougeling holding a rock, indicating that he may have had a similar desire and or obsession with land to Enel. Because mate, I haven't seen someone this excited about holding a rock since Jonathan Joestar. And you know, searching the Blue Sea, that is a thought that would never have crossed Enel's mind. Because how could such a holy place exist below him, the holy man? It must be above, because that is the domain of a god. But Urouge elected to abandon this idea and became a fallen monk, to commit what would look like heresy in the eyes of Enel, and condemning himself to the lowly mortal world. Which also goes on to explain pretty much everything Urouge has done on the Blue Sea so far. Urouge clearly has his own personal motivations, because one does not simply wander into Totterland and defeat one of Big Mom's sweet commanders without some sense of purpose. And that sense of purpose isn't necessarily wanting to fight or declare war like a Eustace kid or just be a prick in any way. The sense of purpose could be that Urouge just needed to get into Totterland in order to search for the Endless Earth. And when he didn't find it, he retreated to a comfy Sky Island after defeating Charlotte's Neck. And something that I love about catching up with Urouge on that there Sky Island is that the narrator says, in a certain sky, as if there's more than one sky, in the same way that there's more than one sea. And it makes me feel like there's a whole world up there that we have barely touched. I mean, for example, this is a location called the Balloon Terminal, a Sky Island held up entirely by balloons, which I think is an idea that's so stupid that I can't help but absolutely love it. But this is also making me start to think that Urouge may have left Burka before Enel destroyed it in order to pursue these desires, and even potentially follow in the footsteps of Nika by seeking out freedom. Or if Burka had a direct connection to Joy Boy, emulating his pilgrimage by becoming a pirate and pursuing his faith that way. Because there were no answers for Urouge waiting in the sky. At best, what he was given was a false god in the form of Eminem, and this is the way I prefer to think about Urouge. Not so much as a man whose faith has been broken, but as someone who has abandoned the institution of faith and is in pursuit of something more pure, similar to Bartholomew Kuma's belief in Nika. Speaking of, Urouge and Kuma have a startling set of similarities. They're both 47 years old, they both have similar heights and builds, at least in Urouge's bulked up Karma form, and both characters were designed by Oda to tank an unfathomable amount of pain. But this is how I think Urouge ties into the final saga of One Piece. If we're correct and the true dawn of the world is to reduce the flood waters back to pre-Void Century levels and shine glorious light on this land trapped in the darkness, then that is also the solution to Urouge finally discovering the mythical Endless Earth, which makes him a very natural ally. And it might even set up an appearance during Elbaf. Because something else I should note about Burka is that it has very interesting ties to Viking culture, given that Burka is the name of Sweden's oldest town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site founded in 750 AD, which served as a very important trading center during the Viking Age. It is admittedly a loose tie to Elbaf, but I really wouldn't be surprised if this arc incorporated Urouge. The large Yggdrasil-like tree almost certainly extends to the height of Sky Islands at least, with both civilizations having a connection to Nika, so Urouge could fit shockingly well into Elbaf. And really, this is probably the last arc of substance before the final war, and Urouge is the last Worst Generation member to cover. And if Eiichiro Oda can pull off tying Urouge into the story, then we will have a full complement of Worst Generation character arcs. When will One Piece end? Well, I have an answer for you, but I'm not sure if you're gonna like it. One Piece is currently set to end with chapter 1350, which at our current rate of publishing should be expected somewhere in the year 2032. Those are both big numbers, the chapters and the year. They seem pretty outrageous, but there is a pretty undeniable logic to this conclusion. And this logic comes courtesy of Mr. Morge, who has put together a shockingly compelling argument for this to be the case, which serves as the foundation for this video, and his work will be linked in the description. Now let's address this right from the get-go. One reason why this sounds immediately outrageous is because it contradicts the words of series author Eiichiro Oda. However, nobody is better at contradicting Oda than Oda himself. In 1997, when first starting the series, Oda originally planned for One Piece to run for 5 years. And by the end of that 5-year period, we'd started Skypiea, and it was clear that things weren't ending anytime soon. In 2004, Oda told his wife and former Nami cosplayer that he'd finish One Piece in 10 years. But 10 years later, by that point, we were in early Dressrosa, and the series, again, wasn't ending anytime soon. Although funnily enough, in 2009, around the time of Impel Down and Marineford, Oda was on his greatest high or greatest low, depending on how you look at it, and he said in an interview that One Piece would probably never end. Then in 2012, Oda got a bit more indirect with his answers and said that One Piece was 60% done, which sounds pretty on point until 2016, when he revised that number to 65% finished, meaning that if 4 years continue to account for 5% of the story, then One Piece wouldn't be over for another 28 years, with the final chapter being published in 2044. Thankfully, in 2018, Oda revised this number to 80%, having had a very productive 2 years, apparently cramming 15% of the story in there. Meanwhile, in 2020, Oda got a bit sick of maths and stated that One Piece would end in, 4 to 5 years. And then in 2022, the most recent statement, he doubled down and said that he was aiming to finish the series in 3 years, all of which takes us to an end point of about a year from now. And that is not even close to true, because the Final War saga has only just begun. But the reason why I took you through all of that is to say that Oda's words cannot be trusted. However, this is a case where his work speaks for itself. You can't trust what he says, but his work is shockingly consistent and reliable, and it will give you the answers you seek. However, we miss these answers because of a point Mr. Morge brought up, being the very real idea that too many readers obsess over exact numbers. And I do agree with this because I think that zooming in too close doesn't allow us the peripheral vision to see the bigger picture. For example, a lot of people profoundly believe that Dragon would appear in chapter 1100 purely because his first appearance was in chapter 100, and the number 100 is kind of like 1100, so it is guaranteed to happen. And then when it didn't, people were convinced that it would be 1101, and when that didn't happen, it was going to be 1102, and so on and so forth. And now this has evolved into one of my favorite running gags in this fan base, where each week disappointed Dragon fans hope that this mate is finally Dragon's time to shine before inevitably crossing the chapter number off. That is a case of using numbers to make bad predictions. And in his video, Morge also highlights another one of these cases, which I refer to as coincidental numbers, such as the frankly crazy instance where Gear 2nd was first showcased in chapter 387, and Gear 4th first appeared in that exact reverse number sequence, 783. Stuff like that is pretty cool when it happens, but Oda isn't fixated on it, and he certainly doesn't plan them out to this sort of detail. And when we look at the bigger picture, again, things become startlingly clear. And so I will now take you to the pattern that Morge has noticed post-time skip, which is that every major piece of story fits very cleanly into an increment of 50.
At about chapter 600, the post-time skip begins. At about chapter 650, Fishman Island ends and Punk Hazard begins. At about chapter 700, Punk Hazard ends and Dressrosa begins. Dressrosa then runs for about 100 chapters from chapter 700 to 800. At about chapter 800, Zou begins, and from 800 to 900, Oda fits in the Zou arc and the long Whole Cake Island arc. At about chapter 900, Whole Cake Island ends and Wano begins. Wano then stretches about 150 chapters to chapter 1050.
I thought this was a really good way of breaking it down, because it again made me think about how much we zero in on precise numbers too much. And a great example of this is the Zou arc. It is a mere 23 chapters and a complete aberration of the post-time skip era. However, what it does is combine with Whole Cake Island's 78 chapters to give us an almost perfect 100 chapter total. And remember, Zou can be considered the start of Whole Cake Island. Yes, it's setting up other things, but the main driving force is that Sanji's gone and that we should maybe do something about it. It's very much the Jaya to Whole Cake Island Skypiea. And yet so many people, very much including me by the way, often use Zou as a metric. Like when Egghead Island began, I am certain I said on multiple occasions that we were probably going to have a Zou length arc, and that was completely the wrong way to be thinking about it, because it focused on using one aberration as a metric as opposed to the greater trend. And speaking of the greater trend, Morge puts an emphasis on this being a post-time skip thing, but it was very much this way pre-time skip as well. The East Blue Saga was exactly 100 chapters on the dot. That is what started this whole 100 interval story system. The Alabasta Saga then followed this as best it could, going a bit over, concluding with 117 chapters. The Skypiea Saga then corrected for this, ending with about 85 chapters. Then Water 7, the larger saga post-time skip, is almost exactly 150 chapters, aka pretty much the length of Wano. Then Thriller Bark is just shy of 50 chapters, being by far the shortest pre-time skip saga, although still sticking to the 50 increment. And then the Paramount War saga is just over 100 chapters, concluding the first half of the series at almost exactly 600 chapters. 6 sagas, 600 chapters, almost 600 chapters. Oda was only 3 short. So this is a case where Morge is even more right than he realizes, because this trend isn't unique to post-time skip One Piece, and it does go on to explain some oddities, such as this very potentially being the reason why the end of Wano felt a bit rushed. Although one explanation for that is because Oda actively admitted to speeding up the ending so that he could make Shanks appear just in time for the release of One Piece Film Red. But the other explanation is because he could have had that hard 50 increment, an increment that he'd hit 3 times over. Wano took us into new territory. Prior to that, segments of stories were at most 100 chapters. That was the hard line. But Wano then took us into a new realm of 150. Well, more accurately, Wano was 149 chapters, so in this case, it would appear that Oda just ran out of time within his own system and had to do the best he could with the amount of chapters he had budgeted. Because if he didn't do this, One Piece would have spiraled even more out of control. And something else to keep in mind is that in response to this, you could say, mate, 10 extra chapters, what's the big deal? Do it, story man. Just take a tiny bit of time to really sit with that ending. You know, the criticism that people like me give him. Well, in reality, it's not just a bit of time. For the past few years, the average amount of chapters published per year has been sitting in the low 30s. So asking for what sounds like a simple 10 chapters amounts to a third of a year's worth of work. And even 5 chapters accounts for a sixth of the entire year. So time and space is pretty absurdly tight, and that's why the Egghead chapters feel so incredibly content rich, because Oda is working overtime to really cram as much into them as possible. But with all of that in mind, we can use this system to predict the final length of One Piece, at the very least with more accuracy than any other prediction, even Eiichiro Oda's own words. Because it's incredibly unlikely that Oda is going to deviate from this 50 increment system. If he did, it would result in one of 2 events. Firstly, he tries to reduce the story increment, and more than likely has future arcs feeling very underwhelming compared to everything that has come before them. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Because even East Blue, the very first saga, made use of this system. Meanwhile, option number 2 for deviation is to abandon the limit and push beyond. To not care about the system, but that risks elongating One Piece by whole years very quickly, because remember, even 10 chapters at this point is a third of a year. Oda needs a limit, but he also needs to tell a satisfying story. So that leaves us with what's provided both of those things for the last 27 years, the 50, 100, 150 increment system. So using that, let's figure out how long Elbaf's gonna be. So we're in a bit of a tricky situation with Egghead Island, which at the time of this recording still has yet to conclude, and we're currently sitting at 63 chapters, which crazily enough makes it the 4th longest arc in all of One Piece at this point. Currently, the only longer arcs are, in this order, Whole Cake Island, Dressrosa, and Wano. And I don't think that anyone would have predicted that going into Egghead Island. But this actually gives us a reasonable estimation of how long Elbaf is going to be, because it's either planned to be a short complement to Egghead Island, something that will last maybe just over 30 chapters, to combine with Egghead Island to make another classic Oda 100 increment story beat before heading into the final war. That, or we're looking at something much longer, and Egghead will be more around the length of 90 chapters to bring us to that new 150 increment number along with Egghead. And I do think there's very good reason to believe that Egghead and Elbaf are connected, because this has been a surprisingly Robin-centric affair with all of the Ohara stuff, all of which has been inherited by Elbaf and is waiting for Robin on the island. We've also been on Elbaf already to check in with Shanks and see him briefly dismiss Eustace Kid, plus the Giants themselves have arrived to Egghead Island to give us a proper Viking escort to Elbaf because I guess they got tired of waiting. Egghead Island does a lot of things, so many things, but what it's doing is priming Elbaf. It serves as a fluffer to the mighty Giants. So in the shortest case scenario where Elbaf comprises that mid-30s chapter number, assuming that we begin the arc soon, we're probably looking at concluding it around the beginning of 2026. But I really don't know if I see that being the case. Because here's something else that we need to consider. Elbaf is very potentially going to be a kingdom arc, our last kingdom arc. And to define what I mean by a kingdom arc, I'm talking about a location where there is an established group of royalty and a localized conflict within that region. One that requires us to thoroughly explore the land to get to know the citizens, usually including a child with some sort of rough history, and generally fleshing out the local politics of the kingdom before doing some punch fighting and saving the day. That's what I mean by a kingdom arc. as opposed to something like Zou, which does technically take place on a kingdom. But all of this stuff, it takes time, so much time. When we visit kingdoms, we need to take a lot of time to get to know the new world we're stepping into, as well as all of the inhabitants, get some emotional bonding done with them, and of course setting up the local conflict to be resolved within that kingdom. And as Morge points out in his video, it's not just about what's happening on the island, but elements also get dragged in from the outside that only extends how long everything takes. To illustrate, on Whole Cake Island, we weren't just dealing with the realm of Totterland and the Big Mom pirates. Capone Gang Beige and the Fire Tank pirates were brought in, Germa 66 was brought in, some of the Mink tribe from Zou were carried over, the Tea Party brought the Underworld Emperors into the mix, there was also a whole story with Jinbei and the remnants of the Sun Pirates, and with all of this, it's not just about local issues anymore. The story becomes how about all of these factions interact and react to one another. And Elbaf might seem like a very isolated location, but we are bringing so much baggage to this island. Firstly, there is a chance that Eustace Kid might still be hanging around on the coast somewhere, but the Straw Hats are also escorting what remains of Vegapunk to the island, as well as potentially Bonnie and Kuma. Then on the island itself, we've got a whole legacy of O'Hara waiting for us with Jaguar D. Sol in all the books. There's also the potential to be pursued there by the Marines, or intercepted on the island by another emperor. No doubt there will be some Shanks related business to deal with there as well. And all of this is before we've even started to look at the island itself. We haven't even mentioned giants. So this stuff takes time. So long that post-time skip, Oda is barely even done setting up for a kingdom arc within 30 chapters. The most generous post-time skip kingdom arc I can think of is Fishman Island, and 30 chapters into that, we'd only just finished the setup and begun the fight at Gyeongkod Plaza. That's the best case scenario because it gets a lot crazier comparing it to the more recent kingdom arcs like Dressrosa, Whole Cake Island, and Wano, all of which had barely gotten anywhere by the 30 chapter mark. So if Oda is planning for Elbaf to be one of his classic kingdom arcs, I think it's feeling like it'll be more around the 80-90 chapter mark. And I know that probably sounds like a lot, but on the other hand, 30 sounds like not a lot. And there's really no in between because from all available evidence, those are the only two options. The shorter path concludes this section of story with 100 chapters, and the longer path takes us to the newly established by Wano 150 interval. And in that latter case, Elbaf would not be slated to end until somewhere in 2028, which I think is a very realistic prediction. Obviously, anything can happen. Oda might abandon this system that he's been using for 27 years now. I just wouldn't bank on that given how consistent he's been for almost 3 decades now. And all of this is before we even touch the concept of Laugh Tale and or the Final War, which Mr. Morge in his video predicts will be separate arcs. I myself am not entirely certain about that. Especially after chapter 1121, it looks like the Marines and the world government are likely to launch an effort to find the One Piece before any of the emperors, which to me says that Laugh Tale and the Final War are potentially going to be the same arc. But looking at the increments in the most conservative way possible, this would be 100 chapters for all of this. I jump immediately to 100 instead of starting at 50 because there is no way it's 50. It just cannot happen that quickly. And my go-to example as to why this is to simply consider one event being the fight against the Blackbeard pirates. Even if each fight only got 1 chapter, then that's already 10 chapters, aka a third of a year. And that's not going to happen because there's no way that Luffy versus Blackbeard is only going to be 1 chapter. I also highly doubt that Zoro and Sanji will only get 1 chapter, and they're more likely to get 2 full focus chapters each, like when they were fighting King and Queen. So depending on how many Luffy gets, that's what, 15 to 20 chapters, purely focused on fights against this one crew. So by that point, we're almost halfway through the 50 and we haven't even done anything yet. However, one advantage of this Final War section is that we don't have to go through the standard beats of a kingdom arc, because by that point, there shouldn't be any new characters or conflicts to introduce. This is purely the business end where all of our established threads collide. Although the problem with that is that we have so many threads. One massive one being the Revolutionary Army, which this late into the game we still haven't really touched at all. And Monkey D. Dragon is the kind of character who will probably receive a hefty Kuma Trafalgar Law length flashback. In addition to that, we've got the Holy Knights, a brand new faction that are going to need to be explored, especially diving into Shanks' connection with Vigilant Garling. Frostguild are also going to be present and doing something to take up space, I'm sure. And the massive amount of time and space that's going to need to be dedicated to the Marines is absolutely not to be underestimated. estimated. And while I did previously say that, hey, at least we don't have any new characters to introduce and problems to solve, well, that's not necessarily true. Because this is the arc where we'll finally be getting that long-awaited Void Century flashback, where we get to learn about Joy Boy and a whole new world of characters who lived a millennia ago. Unless that happens during Elbaf, in which case it only adds fuel to the 2028 endpoint for that arc. But at this point, I think that even 100 chapters might be on the conservative side for Laugh Tale and the Final War, and we really could be looking at another 150, which is how we arrive at the estimated end date of 2032. Again, I know that sounds like a long time, saying that now in 2024, 8 years away, but putting it on paper in terms of chapters, it feels reasonable. Mostly because I think that Oda has dug himself into a colossal story hole by building so many threads over the past 3 decades that the task of simply paying all of them off is going to take close to a whole 4th decade of the series run, which is far from a guarantee that One Piece will last that long, but anything shorter is going to seriously risk botching the ending and either blitzing through or outright omitting important moments that could have One Piece suffer a Game of Thrones style disaster ending. There's just too much to do, and Oda can't possibly get it all done in the short time that he wants to. So barring any medical necessity to end One Piece earlier, I don't think that Oda will compromise his story. So settle in, because we probably still have quite a long way to go yet. This is the story of Saint Emu Nerona, a story that has already been put on page for us by Eiichiro Oda, and yet a story that doesn't translate into English, which is why a huge part of this video references the insight of the channel Dawn and Dusk, a native Japanese speaker who specializes in breaking down the surprisingly huge details that get lost in the English translation. And as it turns out, we have been missing so much about Emu. So here's some important clarification on the status of exactly what Emu is. It's a very popular theory in the English-speaking fandom that Emu could in fact be a child, mostly because of his very tiny stature sitting on the empty throne and such, the generally slender nature, and the fact that he speaks in the third person in Japanese. Emu refers to himself as Mu, which is the kind of adorable thing that a Japanese child may or may not do. As a quick side note, with the flooding having been confirmed, it's also quite on point that Emu chooses to adopt the name of a hypothetical lost continent, Mu, because that's very much the role that Emu fulfills in One Piece. This gigantic lost piece of history that still lingers on in the dark. As a fun note, almost every world noble in the series speaks with this sort of adorable speech. So for example, the classic way to say I in Japanese would be watashi. But a lot of the world nobles incutify this by saying wachi-shi or even wachi-ki, which is just, it's stupidly adorable. And something that unfortunately doesn't translate into English, which is why they don't even try. And I do think that's unfortunate because it's a very deliberate move by Eiichiro Oda to contrast the horrors that are the world nobles with the cute phrasing of children. Because we need the world nobles to be as far away from reasonable adults as we can. And they do a couple of other odd Japanese sounding things that portray them as just complete whack jobs. Hence the child emu theory, because he does do this to some extent. But the child idea really took off when some gloriously creative mind compared Emu to Max from the book Where the Wild Things Are, where Max ends up becoming king of the wild things, much like how Emu is now the king of the monstrous entities that are the 5 Elder Stars. And also he himself, because we've seen him turn into a monster. But Dawn and Dusk confirms that Emu is portrayed as quite a sophisticated adult due to his speech patterns. Because here is a really fun thing that I love about Japanese. 2 people can say the exact same words, but portray entirely different meanings based on how those words are written on page. In Emu's case, he uses complex adult kanji, whereas child characters tend to speak in much simpler hiragana and katakana, which includes Luffy, by the way. Luffy's dialogue is my favorite to read in Japanese because, being real, it's the only dialogue I can read. My Japanese is not good, and Luffy speaks like a child, a young child, which is very much my level. And although it is possible for a child to act like an adult, which we have an example of in the case of Momonosuke, he often uses complex kanji, but it usually slips back into necessary basic hiragana in order to indicate his age and inexperience. And this time, I want to give a positive shout out to the official English translation, because while it does often get accused of using overly florid language for certain characters, in the case of Emu, this is incredibly appropriate, and I've never personally held the impression that Emu was a child, or at least didn't have the mind of a child. In terms of body, I guess anything goes at the moment. That's the fun of silhouettes. And here's the fun of magical fruit, specifically the Ope Ope no Mi. Something that I really appreciate being cleared up by Dawn and Dusk is what Blackbeard said in chapter 1081 about Trafalgar Law's devil fruit, the ultimate ability of which often gets confused for immortality. In the Viz translation, Blackbeard uses the term eternal life, which is vague enough that it doesn't really help, but the source text isn't much better, because the original Japanese magazine magazine release of that chapter flat out used the word immortality, but then later changed the dialogue for the official volume release. So what the Ope Ope no Mi does can more accurately be described as agelessness. They're very specific about that. It stops your aging, but you can still die via non-aging based methods like swords and stuff. And the reason why going into that was relevant is because it is incredibly likely that Emu has lived since at least the Void Century and had this operation performed on him. And this isn't just speculation from fans, it is speculation from Emporio Ivankov of all people, who made this very clear connection in chapter 1086. Sabo, you said the name Emu earlier. This is going to sound very strange, but amongst the first 20 who created the world 800 years ago, there was a monarch named Saint Emu of the Nerona dynasty. He then whips out his trusty devil fruit encyclopedia and does a bit of a point at the Ope Ope no Mi. Look at this. It said that the means to create everlasting life exist in the world. Well, someone has to have proved it. Someone out there has been living for ages and ages without dying. So narratively, this is Oda spelling out to everyone in the back who probably haven't been paying attention that this is what happened to Emu. And sure, maybe it's a red herring to make us think that the Ope Ope no Mi was involved, but sneaky Oda has other plans, but I don't know, I don't think so. Because while the characters in One Piece aren't always reliable, it is very consistently a series where Oda generally has characters speak truth to the audience, regardless of whether the characters themselves know that truth or not. And then comes a question. The question of why Emu was the only founding king of the world government to have had the Ope Ope's ability used on him, as surely other kings would be pretty keen on that sweet, sweet eternal life. And this is where Dawn and Dusk propose something that I had never thought of, because I just don't have the linguistic skills to put two and two together. This idea is that Emu was actually afflicted with a disease similar to the sapphire scales or amber lead syndrome. And the reasoning behind this is because Emu is also a verb in Japanese, which means to avoid, and can specifically be used to speak in avoidance due to ill omens, taboo practices, or general superstition. Now, this could be a reference to the great taboo that Emu himself is committing, which is sitting on the empty throne. That's a bit of a no-no, as Stelly found out when he engaged in premature self-satisfaction after seeing the empty throne and then made it his goal to attain. However, there could also be a much more tragic element involved. Something that very much takes me back to the story of Baby 5 and how she got her name, being that her parents cared so little about her that they couldn't even be bothered to give her a name, and she was just baby number 5. Emu could be in a very similar situation, because I would personally offer the idea of a Jewelry Bonnie style tragedy where a child was born with an affliction, and so the parents simply named him Emu. They named him Avoid because they wanted nothing to do with him due to the condition, and they also needed to warn others about the disease. So the name Emu is a warning. Avoid. They named the child Avoid and potentially abandoned him, which put Emu on the more evil part of life, and after being made ageless, he rose to become king somehow. In this scenario, I'd have to imagine that Emu was born into a ruling family which was referred to as the Nerona dynasty, and I think that would make sense, because for the sake of keeping up appearances, you really don't want your royal family contaminated. But that may also be why Emu remains hidden from the world, and why Oda keeps him hidden from the readers, so as not to show the markings of the disease. And this may also explain why Emu was so keen on destroying the ancient kingdom, because we've encountered a situation like this twice in One Piece with 2 Worst Generation members. In Trafalgar Law's case with Amber Lead Syndrome, it was incurable without magical fruit powers. Law ate the Ope Ope no Mi and was then able to cure himself with the combination of his medical knowledge. But for a strictly science-based approach, Jewelry Bonnie sapphire scales could be cured. However, it took the brightest mind on the planet, and even then the cost to do so was prohibitively expensive. So expensive that Kuma had to pay for Bonnie's treatment with his ultra-rare buccaneer blood, as well as his likeness rights and probably even merchandising rights to create a series of Pacifista clones. And then when they become popular, the world government could start selling Pacifista action figures at outrageous retail prices. So POV, it's 800 to 900 years ago, and you are born with, for argument's sake, sapphire scales. Sorry, not a great start to life. And given that it's 800 to 900 years in the past, the medical system, mate, it is even less equipped to deal with your impending death. So you travel around the world searching fruitlessly, pun intended, for a cure. But there is one hope. You, child Emu, have heard tell of a great kingdom, a location with scientific knowledge so advanced that it may as well be sorcery. So if anyone has a cure for your disease, it's them. But you arrive at the ancient kingdom and they have no incentive to help you. The procedure to cure your disease is like mega expensive, and they can't spare the resources because they're too busy furthering science and mankind and all of that. So they turn you away and you're pretty upset about this situation. You silently vow to yourself that if you, child Emu, were to ever become king of the world, then you're going to make it your mission to wipe each and every one of these demons off the planet. But finally, there is some good news. A lovely young lady by the name of Nefeltari Lily makes an appearance and takes to you like a Rocinante to a law, and just so happens to know that there may be a possible cure in the form of a magical heart-shaped fruit. Lily then takes child Emu to a renowned miracle doctor who has consumed the fruit, but oh no, not even the powers of the Ope Ope no Mi are strong enough to remove whatever is causing this fatal disease. But the doctor in question doesn't give up. Sure, he, she, or it cannot cure the condition, but a little bit of creative thinking later, the doctor decides that they can use the fruit to make Emu ageless to counter the most dire consequence of his condition being, death. But we're really pushing the boundaries of this fruit. And the perennial youth surgery, it does succeed, but at a great cost. Unknown to the doctor, this process would drain so much stamina that it would claim the doctor's life. And this tragic moment is what spawns the legend of the Ope Ope no Mi's immortality operation, and why, to this day, the ability is logged and very publicly available in the Devil Fruit Encyclopedia. But it could even have a much more tragic one-piece twist, like maybe a retainer of Emu who is banished with him chooses to sacrifice themselves to perform the operation. And this could explain what seems to be Emu's small body. Because to use Sapphire Scales as an example again, that was a disease that Bonnie had from birth, and it was said that she wouldn't live to see her 10th birthday. Law with Amber-Led syndrome was very similar. He was not going to live long enough to become an adult. And so if Emu was granted agelessness to combat the disease, then we do have an explanation for his seemingly teeny tiny body. I keep saying seemingly because Emu is so hard to judge in terms of size. We only really see him in comparison to already oversized objects. So that could just be giving the impression that he's tiny. He might actually be massive. But there could also be horrifying connections to Sapphire Scales, because Ginny was infected with that disease on purpose by Saint J. Garcia's Saturn. But where did Saturn find this disease / how did he conjure it? Well, if Emu actually had it or a variant of it, then that's a pretty easy source of infection right there. And the reason why Saturn may have been experimenting on humans was to ultimately try and find a cure for Emu, which is also why Saturn may have been incredibly accommodating to Vegapunk and Kuma, knowing that he could go on to use this process for glorious Lord Emu. And now that Emu is free of that accursed condition, it is time to seek out Lily, who is admittedly a couple of centuries too dead. Okay, that's fine. There's plenty of other lily-shaped fish in the sea that I, Emu, have created by flooding the world. So you know what? I'll settle for a Vivi. Then we'll get married and, I don't know, sex, ? I mean, what else do you really do at that point? But we're really getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. The idea is that Emu held a grudge against the Great Kingdom and even considered them genuine demons for not helping him. Then he slid on back into the DMs of the Nerona dynasty, who he also wasn't particularly pleased with for ostracizing him, and plotted to murder each and every one to eventually become the king of the kingdom place. And then it was off to war with the Great Kingdom. At some point, Emu acquires Uranus, and then perhaps goes pew pew a few times, and then says to every other kingdom, hey guys, I can't believe that bad Great Kingdom used a super weapon to massacre all of that stuff. I think someone needs to stand up and stop them. So what do you say, Mina-san? And the nation of Alabasta was of course part of Mina-san, now led by Nefeltari Lily, who initially believes Emu and joins the 20 Kingdom Alliance. But along the way, Lily discovers the horrifying truth and defects, which is why Alabasta now sits in this awkward state of both being aligned with the world government, but also supportive of the Joy Boy. And in order to avoid being Lelouciad, publicly the kingdom needed to support the world government. But privately, they supported their monarch Nefeltari Lily, because Alabasta loves their royalty. And so they even allowed her to hide a cheeky mystery cube with the rest of the dead kings. And just on that, there's also a fascinating sub-theory that Nefeltari Lily was the original owner of Bartholomew Kuma's Devil Fruit, and that's how she was able to scatter the poneglyphs across the world. That, or she knew someone else who did, because otherwise that would have been a logistical nightmare. Either way, Emu himself is feeling a little bit betrayed and spends the next 800 years thinking to himself in the shower about what he could have said to keep Lily by his side. But instead, he has to settle for a portrait and a vat of regret, because sure, he got his revenge, but at what cost? And then we have the issue of agelessness, which meant that Emu had to disappear, or people were going to start to ask questions like, why isn't that child getting adulted? And speaking of questions, I have another, because we now know exactly half of the 20 founding family names. We have Nefeltari, Vigilant, Don Quixote, Jay Garcia, Marcus Topman, Ethan Baron Shepherd, Man Mayer, and of course, Nerona. All of which now have descendants carrying on those names. So what I want to know is, are there any modern day Neronas? Does the Nerona dynasty still exist? Are there any children of Emu, Emlets, if you will? Or as far as the world is concerned, is this dynasty dead? Because it would be pretty wild for someone to be revealed as a direct descendant of Emu. Someone like St. Charlos, for example, whose family name we still have yet to learn. And something interesting that I learned about the Nerona name is that it's written in katakana, Nerona. And when you put all three of those characters together, they form the kanji for God. So Emu's surname is just God. And here's a bonus little bit of native insight into our very own Monkey D. Luffy, which actually comes to us courtesy of Whoop Slap. One of the reasons why I love Whoop Slap so much is because he's a character who people forget and for some reason seem to think is named Wood Slap. Please stop doing that. But I also love him because he is a small, completely insignificant character who just so happens to know a big and very significant world-changing secret. Because all the way back in chapter 96, when he and Makino see Luffy's first bounty, look, Whoop Slap, he's not thrilled with what's happening here. To which Makino says that it was Luffy's dream, and Whoop Slap replies, his dream or his destiny? I have always loved this line, but the meaning, again, it's very much lost in English. In Japanese, there are two major words for destiny, being unmei and sadame, with unmei referring to fortune and misfortune outside of someone's control. Sort of like being blessed or cursed, but not directly writing someone's destiny. Meanwhile, sadame means an unavoidable, predetermined fate, and that is the word that Whoop Slap used in chapter 96, indicating that Luffy's journey, which began long before chapter 1 of the series, even before the Void Century with Joy Boy, and perhaps even before the sun god Nika made a mark on the world, is all unavoidable destiny. So thanks again to Dawn and Dusk for providing a lot of the insight that led to the madness of this video, and definitely check them out if you enjoy breakdowns of cross-cultural semantics. It's much more interesting than it sounds. Here's what Zoro is going to do after becoming the undisputed king of sharp metal. So the first stop on the Zoro success train is a stupidly obvious one, which is to then make Luffy the Pirate King. Mihawk said that becoming the Pirate King is even more difficult than defeating him. And part of why Zoro now strives to become the world's greatest swordsman is so that he can use that power to make Luffy the Pirate King, which has interesting implications for the final saga. Because if Mihawk is Zoro's final opponent, then Mihawk has to stand directly in Luffy's way, meaning that our sword boy would have to throw his full support behind Buggy and Crossguild. Or Zoro becomes the world's greatest swordsman and his final fight is him defending that title against, say, Shiryu, the nominated sword boy of the Blackbeard pirates. Whichever way it goes, let's say we succeed, Luffy becomes the Pirate King, then does that other thing he wants to do that we're not quite sure of yet. But after that, what next? The Straw Hats will eventually disband, although I think the word eventually isn't the most appropriate. Much like the sudden announcement from Roger, I think that Luffy will disband the crew very abruptly the moment that his dream is fulfilled. And at that stage, I think that one of the first things that Zoro was going to do is return to Shimotsuki Village in East Blue. And along the way, it would be great if he could stop in at Shellstown for a brief reunion with Rika, the girl that Zoro saved from Helmeppo's wolf. Maybe she'll treat him to some rice balls that she's perfected over the years. And so Zoro will take one bite and say, "It tasted better when you used dirt, kid." I, Zoro, love me some dirt. And I think another mandatory stop would be Kokoyashi Village, because that's where Johnny and Yosaku now live permanently, and I would feel a bit robbed if they didn't get to fawn over their Aniki one last time. But then it's on to Shimotsuki Village. After becoming the world's greatest swordsman, the Wado Ichimonji will have served its purpose, and I think that Zoro will want to return it to Kuina, to allow her to rest in peace with her spiritual contribution to taking the title. Although we do have some unfinished business in Shimotsuki Village. Before depositing the sword in the sword bank, Zoro should probably settle the score with down D stairs once and for all, because Mihawk was never the greatest challenge that a swordsman could face. stairs. These stairs claimed the life of the most talented sword wielder this world has ever known, and they need to pay. And all of this is well and good in theory. However, the problem is there's no real telling the first thing that Zoro's going to do, because no matter what he decides, it's all entirely subject to whether or not he gets lost along the way. And I can see a future where Zoro spends the rest of his life trying to find his way back to Shimotsuki Village to visit Kuina's grave. Imagine this. Zoro's very last panel in One Piece is him setting out to go home, but then stopping and saying, now which way was it again? And then going in the complete opposite direction and ending up in West Blue or something. Although if the dawn of the world happens as we now anticipate, and the ocean height drops to pre-Void Century levels, then Zoro could become a very stereotypical wandering samurai. Because he won't have to rely on being on a ship, he'll be able to walk from place to place to place with his leg to leg to leg, which doesn't fix his sense of direction, but it does give him a lot more options to get lost. Kind of like the land equivalent of Mihawk floating around the Grand Line in his coffin boat, except that Zoro's sense of direction is so unpredictable that he becomes known as this legendary natural disaster, living out a life of attempting to perform mundane activities, but causing huge problems wherever he goes. Like on Sabadi when Zoro wanted to go fishing but got on the wrong ship, so he cut the whole thing and ended the dreams and careers of an entire pirate crew. And to his credit, Zoro would remain the world's greatest swordsman for the rest of his life, primarily because no one can find him to challenge him. And eventually Zoro's name could fall into myth because almost no one remains who can confirm that he ever actually existed. And then at the age of 70, 80, maybe even 90, Zoro accidentally finds his way back to Shimotsuki Village to visit Kuina's grave and makes a heavily understated apology, saying something like, sorry I'm a bit late, got a little bit lost along the way. That may not be Zoro's endgame, because it's also possible that he takes up residence on Wano. Wano is definitely an island that suits Zoro's elected lifestyle. Having been brought up in a Wano colony, he just gets the culture. He's very comfortable, and due to his status as a hero, I'm sure that he'll have endless alcohol granted to him and drink the country dry. So I posed this question to all of you in a community post. I said, what is Zoro going to do after he becomes the world's greatest swordsman? And one of the main responses I got was, go to Wano and get some cheeks. And the same user then felt the need to clarify, Hiyori cheeks. And I agree with that clarification. Zoro can't just renounce his piracy, become a booty hunter and source Wano cheeks indiscriminately, because he'd be very likely to end up with Kinemon. But we should talk about the potential coupling with Hiyori. In my opinion, the only time that the topic of shipping is worth talking about in One Piece is when we're talking about the very end of the series. Because Eiichiro Oda goes to great lengths to avoid substantive romance in One Piece, as do most shonen authors. However, there is a bit of a trend at the end of long-running shonen series to have a lot of the established characters pair off to live happily ever after and such. And we have seen the seeds of many Straw Hat couplings in the New World era. The other key one being Chopper and Milky, which will almost certainly be a thing. And as for Sanji, he has some options with either Pudding or Viola. But we're not here to talk about Sanji, so strike that remark from the record. And I'd actually forgotten about this, but going back on Wano, there's a scene where Hiyori takes credit for cleaning Zoro while he was asleep for a week, and then proceeded to ask Zoro if that thought was exciting for him. Hiyori very clearly has a thing for moss men, and all that's currently missing is Zoro's interest. But Hiyori is very likely the reason why Zoro will travel back to Wano even if he's not interested in her. Hiyori was the one who convinced Zoro to part with Shusui by explaining that it was a national treasure and the need for it to be returned to its rightful place. And so, in exchange, she offered her father's sword Enma. And if Zoro no longer sees the need to get stronger, which is a big if that we'll talk about in a bit, but it's not out of the question to imagine him returning Enma to the Kozuki clan or laying it to rest at Odin's shrine, just as Shusui guards Ryuma's grave. Speaking of Ryuma's grave, one of the reasons why I think Zoro absolutely needs to return to Wano is because he asked Hiyori to visit Ryuma's grave, which he never did, because he was asleep for a week and by the time he woke up there was no time for sword tourism. But this could also fall into a long list of things that people said they do on Wano but just never did. Like how Luffy said that they would have Jinbei's crew toast together after defeating the Kaido. And to this very day, Jinbei is still awkwardly waiting for that promise to be fulfilled, just standing there in the background going, hey guys, you remember the thing? But there's a very good reason for Zoro to end up back on Wano, at least temporarily. And if a bit of a thing did happen with Hiyori, then Zoro would end up with Denjiro as his weird stepfather-in-law. Alternatively, have you ever considered the following? Zoro isn't too different from a genie. You rub the magic sake bottle, out pops a Zoro, and he proceeds to dedicate his life to making your wish come true, whether that be Kuina's dream of becoming the world's greatest swordsman or Luffy's dream of becoming the Pirate King. He's a very helpful genie, and there is a third dream in close proximity to Zoro that he may decide to pursue next. There is one dream that almost certainly will not be completed by the time that One Piece is over, which is Tashigi's dream of taking charge of all the Meito blades so that they can't be used by evil people. Because Tashigi empathizes with swords more readily than she's capable of empathizing with most humans. Which isn't as ridiculous as it sounds, because in One Piece, certain objects do have wills and personas of their own. Several swords have displayed their own unique personalities, but also think of something like the Going Merry. Tashigi believes that blades in the hands of ne'er-do-wells are crying for liberation, and that she is going to be the joy boy of the sharp metal world. So Tashigi's dream is to acquire the 7 supreme grade blades, then the 21 great grades, and the 50 skillful grades. So she needs to acquire 83 renowned metals in the hands of exceptionally skilled and powerful wielders. That is not going to be a quick or an easy task. And like Luffy becoming the Pirate King, it's not something that she can do alone. And given that at this point, Zoro has already made Kuina's dream come true, it feels only right to make other Kuina's dream come true as well. And you know, Zoro and Tashigi's fight against Monet established that they aren't a terrible team. They have a very fun comedic dynamic after Punk Hazard, which significantly de-escalated the tension. And I've always loved that it was Tashigi who delivered the final blow to Monet, because it showed that Tashigi is a very reasonable, logical person, and those qualities make up for the colossal gaps in Zoro's brain matter. Zoro needs maybe not Tashigi herself, but someone like Tashigi at the very least. On the crew, we have characters like Nami and Sanji that fill those logic gaps for him. And during the time skip, that person was Perona. So after the Straw Hats have disbanded, if Zoro's going to do anything of substance with the remainder of his life, he's going to need a new person to fulfill that role. And you know, Zoro may even feel indebted to Tashigi for guiding him to the Sandai Kitetsu. And by the end of One Piece, he may even be able to empathize with her feelings towards swords and their feelings towards whatever they have feelings for. Given that Zoro has gradually been experiencing the increasingly dominant personalities of his own assorted pieces of sharp metal. And so he becomes known as Mato Hunter Zoro, the completionist of the One Piece world, just without the charity scandals. At this point, Zoro has beaten the final boss and finished the game. However, he now goes on a quest to 100% the game, establishing his dominance by challenging every user of a Mato blade and collecting them after if he wins. Meanwhile, Tashigi can be kind of like his Navi, saying, hey, listen, hey, listen, hey, listen. It'll be great fun. Because the end of One Piece doesn't just mean the end of the story, it also coincides with the end of an era for this planet and the beginning of another. Things are going to be very different in almost every way imaginable. The landscape of the planet itself will change, the political systems will radically shift, and we may very well enter a world that no longer has need for either pirates or marines, which means that there's no legal or ideological barrier stopping a Zoro Tashigi team. Although it probably wouldn't be a romantic dynamic. Hey, you look exactly like my dead best friend, wanna bang, is probably not going to go down as well as Zoro wants her to go down. And I do think it's a little bit weird. The idea that every time you look at your partner, you're actually seeing a different person. But if Zoro and Tashigi did end up together, and it's not completely off the table, at least we know what her wedding dress would look like, thanks to the One Piece collaboration with Placol. Now, here's a crack idea. A consistent thread within Zoro's life is the issue of gender. Kuina brought it up to him when she expressed concern that it was impossible for a woman to become the world's best. And this thread persisted into Tashigi, who has on multiple occasions accused Zoro of not taking fights seriously because his opponent was a woman, whether it be Tashigi herself or Monet. So here's the idea, right? Zoro, he's sick of all of this gender whinging, so he rocks up to Emporio Ivankov and he says, yo, magic fingers, hit me with some sweet, sweet estrogen and turn me into a woman. After which point, Zoro sets out to prove once and for all that the world's greatest swordsman can be a woman, which is a stupid idea. I know it'll never happen, but the issue of a woman's competency in the realm of swordplay is one of the recurring themes of Zoro's character. And Kuina being dead alongside Tashigi constantly feeling inadequate in Zoro's presence aren't really proving Zoro's point correct, because in the end he, a man, will become the world's greatest. So to really hammer that point home that he made to Kuina as a child, he could start this run again with woman mode activated and prove the point once and for all. That, or he can go down the Silver's Ray Lee path of becoming a mentor figure, perhaps even taking on S-Hawk as an apprentice. It's really hard to see Zoro being the teacher of his own dojo or something. However, I could see him falling into a mentor role if his students keep supplying him with alcohol in exchange for lessons. It would probably be more in line with Zoro's interest to open a bar rather than a dojo, although he'd be constantly drinking himself out of business, which I suppose is a very Rayleigh-like maneuver, and Zoro has to find increasingly embarrassing ways to earn money, which means there may be some truth to the bad timeline outcome of him becoming a beggar, because that is the kind of semi-squalor that Silver's Ray Lee now lives in, an endless cycle of gambling then selling himself into slavery Hiyori to pay the debts. It should be noted that Zoro already has disciples out there in the world. During the second From the Decks of the World cover story, we checked in with Shimotsuki Village, and all of the kids there had decided to adopt three-sword style, and even taped their left eyes closed to emulate Zoro's one-eye vision. And if they emulate his dream as well, then these kids could set sail in the hopes of challenging Zoro and becoming the next world's greatest swordsman. Again, good luck finding him though. But I also think that we might be taking Zoro's ambition for granted here. After taking the title, getting drunk, and taking a nap, Zoro is probably going to get right back into training to keep the title, knowing that someone will always be around the corner to try and take it from him. And Zoro may even aim to hold onto the title for his entire life in order to preserve Kuina's dream as long as possible. But also, beating the world's greatest swordsman doesn't mean that you've personally hit your ceiling. When Oda revealed the good timeline Zoro at ages 14-60, he'd gone on to successfully innovate 4-sword style and even 5-sword style. I really don't think that Zoro is going to stop pushing himself just because he got a title. It just means that he needs to set his sights even higher. And here's the thing about that. Even the title of World's Greatest Swordsman starts to feel very small in the grand scheme of One Piece. A series where we have confirmed that aliens exist. They live among us on the planet right now, and they are plentiful to be found on the various moons confirmed to exist in outer space, let alone the potential for other planets. And we do have confirmation of some incredibly bizarre and advanced races in outer space who do fight, admittedly not with swords that we've seen, but similar pokey kind of weapons, enough to give Zoro a challenge, I'd say. And if Zoro ever learns that aliens exist and that space travel is possible, he may even set his sights here and aim to become the greatest swordsman in the universe, thus setting the stage for the One Piece spin-off titled Lost in Space, or maybe something else because it's already a thing. But you get the idea. That this is Zoro. Subscribe to the channel, consistent injections, etc. See you in the next video. Goodbye.